the terrible night when he watched his sister disappear into a burning building to save her husband. A building that exploded with hellfire and collapsed and burned. A building she never walked back out of. Eric found himself screaming as two guards grabbed him and hauled him backwards. He struggled and thrashed in their hold, stabbed with his knives as hard as he could until the arms finally fell away. But he could do nothing as a searing heat soared overhead and slammed into the great hole in a torrent of fire and pitch. The blast knocked him and the soldiers flat and sent a concussive blast echoing across the island, pausing fights on land and in the air. It was as if the blast sent a crack through his very soul. Suddenly everything felt quiet. The only thing he could hear was his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears. He could feel the heat before he even moved. Slowly, as if his body couldn't bear to move faster, he got to his hands and knees and gazed upward. The great hole was a shell of its former glory. Completely gutted and burning with a fire so bright, he could feel its heat from the bottom of the stairs. The impact sent cracks splintering into the face of the mountain it had been carved into. Much like his heart. A black cloud of smoke roiled upward, billowing into the dawning skies above. Panting, Eric struggled to his feet and ran up the stairs. He didn't care about the heat. He tried not to care about it. But in truth he couldn't make it all the way to the top. It was simply too hot. And yet, just as he had with his sister, out, he found himself trying to find her. But there was nothing. Nothing but fire and emptiness and a hole that once had been a person. Eric sank to his knees and choked on a sob. He could only stare at the flames and wish that he could turn back time. That he could have had 5 more minutes. That he could have been stronger, faster. That he could have saved her. When the enemy soldiers dragged him to his feet a minute later, daring to brave the heat at last, he didn't fight. Finn and Zap dove again and again and again, fighting through the water, air and land. They used every street, every bit of land and sea, every trick in the book that they knew of. Every ounce of energy they had. But it wasn't enough. Dawn had risen some time ago and they continued to fight. Finn glanced at the horizon with a fierce desperation that he'd never felt before. Begging for the rest of Berk to come home. But they never came. How long had they been fighting? 30 minutes. An hour. Hours. Evan was gone. How many more had been lost? Many of his friends had kept to Zap and Max's tails throughout the entire fight, trying to keep to flight patterns and techniques they'd practiced. But they'd never fought against such an onslaught before. It wasn't long before they were picked off one by one. First, Helga and Shade, who dodged a spear launched by a catapult and fell to the ocean like a pair of stones. Thuggery and his nightmare had dived after them. Finn couldn't check to see what happened next and soon they were lost to the smoke. Then Thorin, who'd never fought with more ferocity, and his Nada were caught in a net that shot from behind. Another pair of riders had dived after them as they'd hurtled toward the water below. All the men and women he'd trained with since becoming captain fell, one by one. And in their eyes all he saw was panic. Genevieve and Max had kept stride with him and Zap without issue. Her face was streaked with grime from the smoke and she grit her teeth against Max's next volley of electricity that he shot toward the enemy ships below. The strike hit home and anyone holding metal weapons began to shake and convulse. Then they were gone, a pair of blue streaks rising high into the air. The smoke cleared and Finn got a clear view of his village. From the east to the west, it burned. The great hall was a burning husk. The hatchery had sustained heavy damages, but was still standing. Thousands of black-clad soldiers were marching his people into groups. Anyone who might have made it to the catacombs had been rounded up. And the streets were lined with bodies. He'd failed them. The thought sent a prick of anger through him so potent, he almost choked on it. An arrow whizzed by his arm and Zap instantly dove. Genevieve yelped as Max followed suit. They'd both been momentarily stunned by the sight of their home that they'd allowed enemy dragon riders to catch up to them. Finn bent low in his saddle, eager to put some distance between them and light up a few more ships in the harbor on the next turn. Just as they cleared the cliff, there was a new sound. The sound of rushing chains. Then Max and Genevieve screamed. Zap whipped around so fast that Finn nearly got whiplash. A green chain had been shot out of a nearby catapult and wrapped itself around Max's leg. He thrashed and roared angrily, and Genevieve nearly lost her seat. "Max, hold on!" Finn shouted. But even as he said it, another chain shot out and lashed around Max's snout. He quailed and bucked. Zap! She plunged and Finn drew one of his swords. With a savage yell, he slammed his sword against the chain. Except it rebounded and nearly took him out of the saddle. "What?" Finn demanded. "How?" At a particularly sharp thrash, Genevieve launched out of her saddle and slammed back down before toppling sideways. She barely managed to get a handhold with a yelp. "Hold on!" Finn shouted. From below there was another slam of wood on wood, and Finn gasped. A spear had shot toward them from the edge of his vision. He flung himself from the saddle and plummeted just as Genevieve lost her grip. Everything went quiet. They three fell toward the harbor, filled with debris and struggling bodies. The wind rushed in his ears as he turned toward her, reaching with everything he had as she reached up. The ocean rose up to meet them as he grabbed her hand. Claws grabbed his shoulders and yanked them out of their fall. Finn yelled at the pain but refused to release her hand. Genevieve's fingers were clamped tightly around his, desperation etched into every line of her face. Zap keened above him. She'd saved them, but she'd left her mate behind. "We'll get him back," Finn promised to both his girls. IPR. They swooped low over the top of the docks and found themselves blocked by dozens of enemy archers. Zap turned sharply, nearly flinging Genevieve out of his grasp. She didn't see the green chains until it was too late. Zap shrieked as no less than 3 chains wrapped around her body. One grabbed her back legs. The second wrapped tightly around her wings, which sent them hurtling for the ground. And the third wrapped around her jaws, cutting off her cry with unearthly silence. Finn and Genevieve hit the ground hard and rolled until they came to a painful stop. "No!" Finn panted, dragging himself out of the dirt. "No! No!" He charged the chains with his swords and began hacking at them with every ounce of strength he had left. They clanged and clanged and clanged, but all he was doing was wearing himself out and ruining his weapons. Genevieve and more of his people screamed over his shoulder, but that was all the warning he got. A broad body slammed into him without warning and they went sprawling in the dirt. Finn scrambled to his feet, just as Zap thrashed beside him. Fighting to stay free. To stay alive. A second body rammed into him. His people swam in his peripheral, watching with wide, terrified eyes. "No!" Zap gave a wail and collapsed with exhaustion, her breath heaving. A third body joined the others and finally forced him into the ground, unable to fight any longer. He was utterly spent. Rage and wrath and desperation pulsed through him still, but his body failed to respond. There was nothing left. He had nothing left to give. He'd failed. Burke had fallen. Chapter 12, The Mark of a Man. Chapter text. The crackle of fire, the bitter tang of smoke and weeping were a jarring cacophony in Finn's ears. Combined with the crushing weight of 3 men on his back, one planting him firmly into the dirt by the neck, the others holding him down by the shoulders, there was little hope of getting up again. Even if he kept telling himself to get up. To fight back. But after fighting for what might have been hours, after being whipped through the air and landing painfully with a near bone-crushing impact, his body refused to respond. The clatter of weapons, rushing footsteps and scuffles filled his ears as he tried to breathe under the crushing weight. His people were fighting back, or at least trying to. But it was utterly useless. The sound of the women, both young and old, and the children weeping was like a spike to his heart. Stubbornly Finn tried to extricate himself again. One of the soldiers cursed savagely as he yanked his right arm free, but he was quickly subdued again. The hand on the back of his neck tightened painfully. "Knock it off, or I'll knock you out. Let me up and we'll see who knocks who out." Finn bit out. From the corner of his eye, Genevieve had stretched herself over Zap's neck and was crying softly. "You are such a brave, brave girl," Genevieve whispered. "You rest now." Zap keened quietly and turned her eyes toward him. Finn groaned. "It's okay, Zap." He could hardly breathe for the 3 brutes crushing him into the dirt, but he would not falter now. "Good girl." Suddenly the soldiers throughout the square all stood at attention. Though he couldn't see much save for the gravelly dirt beneath his nose, he could tell by the way the men standing around the square, hovering over his people, all hopped to attention, their armor and weapons clanking. A group of people was approaching and all the Burkians seemed to go silent with fear. Genevieve's expression hardened. Everything was quiet for a long minute. And then, "Get him up." Finn saw red. That voice. The guards yanked him to his feet and struggled to keep his arms behind his back as he lunged forward. Brandine Anderson stood before him in a black sleeveless leather jerkin and a satisfied smirk on his face. The scar on his face was stretched maliciously. "You," Finn spat. "Filthy, disgusting coward." Without warning, Brandine drove a fist into the soft space beneath Finn's breastplate. He went to his knees, hacking and gasping, only vaguely hearing the laughs of the men around him. The whimpers of his people. He growled through the pain, unwilling to show weakness. "Not like this. Stubborn." A new voice said. "He will be fun to break, I think." "Not before I've had my turn," Anton said, another smooth voice. "I know you like to play with your food before you eat it, but I prefer my prey in one piece." Gasping and clutching his abdomen, Finn glared up at them. The two men standing beside Brandine were new. One fair and chiseled, the other dark and broken. Both looked at him like he was their next meal. "Fearless Finn," Brandine said, raising a hand to the blonde one. "Meet Slaver Anton." His stomach dropped. And Brandine said, clearly relishing whatever expression he saw on Finn's face. "An old friend of your dad's. Viggo Grimborn." Gobber spat on the ground nearby as a murmur rippled through the captured Burkians, particularly the elderly. "A pleasure to meet you at last, Fearless Finn." Viggo smirked slightly. "I expect your father told you all about our advent." "No." Viggo blinked. "No, what?" Anton cocked his head to the side. Finn smirked. "Never heard of you." Viggo looked affronted. Brandine sniffed in derision. "Don't worry, Viggo. You can have his shock jaw to nurse your wounds. Dragon hunters." To emphasize the point, Viggo snapped his fingers and pointed at Zap. Finn struggled as a pair of soldiers wrenched Genevieve to her feet and another dozen began hooking Zap to a series of hooks and pulleys. Struggling against her bonds, Zap snarled at them as she was slowly dragged away. Genevieve was deposited beside him, her dark eyes fierce with rage despite the tear tracks on her grimy face. She met his eyes briefly before glowering back up at Brandine and his other cronies. Her fearlessness gave him courage and he straightened. "Golden curls, betrothed to the heir to Burke." Slaver Anton said. "The singer. Genevieve Sullivan." Genevieve blinked in surprise. "How do you know my name?" "We've become quite well acquainted with a friend of yours. He sang your praises as he bled." Anton said, reaching down and lifting her chin with a finger. "Tell me. Will you sing too, little bird?" He retracted his hand a mere second before Genevieve's teeth met open air. Wiggling his fingers, Anton laughed. "We'll find out soon enough. She's nothing to fuss over," Brandine said. "Unlike some who require a little more focus." He looked down his nose at Finn. Finn opened his mouth to reply, but suddenly a group of soldiers marched around the corner with someone in tow. It was Eric, his wrists bound with a length of rope. His mismatched steps combined with the heavy-booted steps of the guards were the only sound as they approached. He was shoved onto his knees beside Finn, who looked him up and down. He didn't seem to be injured except for a cut on his brow that had stopped bleeding. There was dried blood down the side of his face, but it was the look in his eyes that sent Finn's heart thundering. "What?" Finn breathed. "Ah, Eric. Nice of you to drop in," Brandine said. Eric said nothing. He didn't even blink. And Finn knew something was terribly wrong. Eric's head felt like it was stuffed with cotton. He knew where he was, what was happening. Brandine was questioning him in front of the remainder of their village. He was on his knees in the dirt beside Finn, who was looking at him with growing horror. He knew something was wrong. Genevieve sat in the dirt on Finn's other side, guards hovering close by with hands on their weapons. Everyone in the village who'd been left behind, everyone who had survived anyway, was now gathered in a large group in the village square. He could feel their presence like a brand, thousands of eyes flickering with fear and rage. And yet he didn't spare them even a glance. How could he? Not when his first love was gone. Adriana. His Annie, was gone. Darin had lost his mother. He was a widower. The sounds around him were dulled and distant, as if his head was underwater. He needed time to think, to grieve. A pair of knuckles struck him across the face and he caught himself on his forearm as he hit the dirt. Sounds returned in a rush, as did the pain. Gasps and whimpers echoed in the otherwise silent crowd. Two soldiers grappled with Finn as he tried to retaliate. A hand grabbed Eric by the scruff of the neck and yanked him up. Suddenly he was nose to nose with the man he hated most. Earth to Larsen. Brandine said loudly. I asked you a question. Wake up and pay attention. Eric felt a sharp pulse of rage deep in his gut. Better. Where is Adriana? The sharp pulse of rage grew. She's gone. Finn went still and stared up at him with wide eyes. Brandine blinked. What do you mean, gone? Eric swallowed thickly. She was in the Great Hall. When it exploded. Genevieve and others gasped in horror. Finn went white. Brandine's blue eyes flicked between his, searching for the lie. It's true, sir. Brandine glared up at the soldier who'd spoken, one of the few brutes who had brought Eric here. Who had kept him from saving his Annie. Even now the man had a hand pressed to a wound on his forearm, where Eric must have stabbed him to get free. To get to her. Not that it had mattered in the end. We ran after the girl and tried to catch her, but she went into the Great Hall right before it exploded. Stupid thing to do, but... A muscle ticked in Brandine's jaw before he let Eric's collar slip through his fingers. All right. Unfortunate, considering I had many plans for her. Eric's stomach twisted in rage. Without warning, Brandine kicked his prosthetic. Eric slammed to the ground and barely managed to catch himself before eating dirt. Shaking, he gritted his teeth and returned to his knees in the calmest way he could. He hoped nobody could see how much his hands were shaking. Where is Darin? Though he'd expected the question and despite his roiling insides, Eric kept his face blank. Brandine sniffed in derision. Well, we've got plenty of time before Daddy tries to save the day. We'll pick up that conversation again later. Eric hoped not. Viggo, why don't you bring out our friends? Brandine asked suddenly. Finn seemed to blink out of a trance. Viggo snapped his fingers and 4 of his men disappeared. Brandine strode up and down the force of captured Burkians, all of whom watched him with wide or enraged eyes. Eric glanced around to see who else had survived. Helga and Thuggery sat side by side, glowering at Brandine. Morgan was sitting beside Thorin, her hand clutched in his. She was weeping silently. His mother Lara sat a few rows behind them. Her back was ramrod straight. She glared up at Brandine without an ounce of fear. Magnus and Greg were clustered around her with their children. All of his nieces and nephews were staring at him with wide eyes. He didn't linger on them. Mel and Ellie sat with them too, though Nicholas was in a group of men who'd been separated. He couldn't see Gustav's wife or their kids. He prayed they were just out of his vantage point. Lofn was nowhere to be seen. Good. A flash of auburn hair caught his eye and he spied Tarin, looking straight at him. Good, she and Cliff. Eric blinked, the haze lifting for only a moment. Where was Cliff? Tarin glanced up at Brandine, who was some feet away. Have you seen Cliff? Eric shook his head. Her eyes welled up with tears. I don't know where he is. I haven't seen him since. Mrs. Smedley. Brandine said suddenly. Did you have something you'd like to say? Tarin covered her mouth and shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She didn't look up at him. Good choice. Brandine said, gazing down at her belly. I wouldn't want something terrible to happen to you or the baby. That said, send out a search party for Cliff. He never shuts up and he's clumsy to boot. I'm sure he'll out himself eventually. He kept walking and smirked as a few dozen men peeled off from the mass of soldiers and disappeared down various streets. I was wondering why it was so quiet. Down, you filthy, disgusting piece of trash. A shrill voice echoed up the ravine. Finn swiveled on the spot. Inga Jorgensen appeared at the top of the docks, her hands bound. She was thrown over a beefy guard's shoulder, her long braids swinging in the air as she dangled. Her blue eyes blazed like an inferno. Without warning, the guard flopped her onto the ground like a sack of potatoes beside Genevieve. Inga growled and struggled to her knees. Inga, Finn breathed. "You're alive." "Of course, I'm alive, you idiot." Despite himself and despite everything, Eric smiled slightly. Adriana would have laughed. A second group appeared at the top of the stairs. A dark-skinned young woman appeared first with scars on her face and shorn hair. She looked around with wide, curious eyes before dropping them and hustling to Viggo Grimborn's side. Next came a pair of guards, who had someone held tightly between them. It was a boy, judging by his build, but a bag had been thrown over his head. Clearly whoever he was, he'd suffered at the hands of someone evil because his arms and chest were wrapped in bandages beneath his shirt. Inga sucked in a breath. "Ah, about time," Brandine said, approaching the group. "People of Berk, I have an announcement for you. Everything that has transpired in the last few weeks, especially the last few days, is all thanks to our honored guest here. As a final gift, I thought I'd return your little homing pigeon back to you for hard work well done." And then he yanked off the hood. Gasps rose up from the crowd, including shrieks from Taryn and Joan Brand. Alton Brand hissed in the morning light, his eyes squinting against the brightness. His normally golden skin from long days in the sun was pale and wan. His usually confident hazel eyes blinked open and widened with horror at what had become of his home. The scars on his face and on his body spoke volumes to the things he'd endured. And they'd done so little to save him. Eric's rage bubbled beneath his skin. Brandine smirked and gave Alton a hard shove. Clearly weak and unable to catch himself, Alton collapsed and coughed. "Behold, your betrayer." His soldiers laughed. Inga growled and started forward, but was wrenched back by a soldier. "Everything that's happened here is your fault, Brand," Brandine said, staring down at Alton with a look of disgust. "You should never have left Berk to begin with." Alton squeezed his eyes shut and shakily got to his hands and knees. But Brandine said in a light tone, "I'm not a monster. I'm not without mercy. Let Joan collect her son, whatever's left of him." Eric's heart twisted in his chest as Joan hustled from the crowd. Taryn wept nearby, clearly wishing to go to her brother. Joan's steps slowed as she approached her son. She slowly knelt before him and lifted his face until their eyes met. "My son, come home to me." Alton's face broke. "Mom. I'm sorry, for everything." "No, no, no," Joan said in a firm whisper, sweeping her hands over his face, ever so gentle over his healing injuries. "What you have endured, my son, has made you so brave and strong. Hear me. This is not your fault." Alton buried his face in his mom's shoulder and for a moment, she sat there and held him. She made no acknowledgement of Brandine looming over her or the soldiers around them. She looked strangely serene, a mother comforting her ailing child and nothing more. But a few moments passed and she slid a hand into his hair. "Come." He stubbornly bit his lip against any pain he felt as he rose and they returned to her seat in the crowd. Clyde helped Alton sit, but not before he threw Brandine a scathing look of hatred. Once settled they wrapped comforting arms around Alton, who closed his eyes. As if trying to feel comfort from their embrace. As if trying to forget. As if he thought he didn't deserve it. Eric added these to his long list of things that never should have happened. Fueling his rage. "Now that that's out of the way," Brandine said. He seemed to be filled with an intense sort of pleasure, as if he'd been planning every second of this in his head for years, and was finally able to play it out. "It's time to discuss Berk's future. It's unfortunate that we don't have our beloved chief and his wife here, along with everyone else, for this important speech, but they'll be along shortly, I'm sure." Brandine gazed out across the people. "How many of you were aware that you've been led under false pretenses for years?" Confusion flickered across many faces. Even Eric frowned, unsure what sort of nonsense this was referring to. "Yes. Now I can't completely blame you for your ignorance, considering you were never told. But if it was me, or many other leaders across the archipelago, across the world, really, it would be paramount to treason to keep certain things secret. Such as, the legitimacy of the right to rule. Brandine smirked savagely and looked directly at Finn, who blinked. Fearless Finn has every right. Gobber sneered. As heir to the Haddock line. Oh, he's the heir. Brandine said, strolling forward. I don't dispute that. But that's not the issue. Is it, Finn? Finn glowered up at him. Without warning, Brandine grabbed a handful of Finn's hair and yanked his head back so far, Eric thought his neck might break. Shouts and cries of shock went up from the crowd as Finn was dragged forward, hissing in pain. Genevieve launched to her feet. She didn't make it more than 2 feet before she was quickly subdued. Eric's rage coiled in his gut like a snake poised to strike, but he froze at the sight of the burn mark seared into Finn's temple. A snake curved into an S. The mark that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Genevieve seemed to notice at the exact same time he did and began to thrash. No. No. Do you see it now? Brandine bellowed. The proof of his own weakness. The slave mark doesn't lie or discriminate. It nullifies the bloodline of any who bears it. And unfortunately for you, Finn, he hissed. That includes you. Brandine shoved Finn hard enough that he barely caught himself on his forearms. He struggled into a crouch and glared up at Brandine, but at the sound of the soldiers' laughter and mocking jeers that rose up in the air, a flush began to creep up his collar. Weak. Fake. Worthless fool. The gathered Burkians stared at Finn in dismay and confusion as Brandine's men bellowed and laughed, the sound rising like a wave. It didn't change anything, not really, but the knowledge was still a shock. It was slight, but Finn seemed to curl into himself ever so slightly as the voices rose and the shock and confusion flickered across the faces of his people. He couldn't lie to them. He couldn't defend himself against the truth. For years, Eric had suspected it. Had wondered and been too cowardly to ask. As a joke, he'd once asked Finn, "What am I, your slave?" And he'd been so utterly confused when the amusement vanished from Finn's face in an instant, and he'd turned away. He hadn't understood it then. But now, as he saw what he didn't see then, the shame mingled with sadness. Fearless Finn had been a slave, just as Benin had been. Eric's rage thrashed in his chest. His friend, no, his brother would not be shamed like this. Adriana would never stand for it. And soon enough Brandine continued, his voice cutting through the jeers and laughter. You Burkians will all find yourselves with one to match. Finn whipped around, aghast. The Burkians stared and then clamored suddenly. Their panic began to churn. Yes, my friend Slaver Anton and I have made an agreement. Brandine said, relishing the fear he was inciting. In about a week, slave ships will be arriving. We will separate you all, one by one, give you the slave mark, and you will be sent across the world. In a week, Burke will no longer exist. But he smiled. Only after Hiccup returns. I plan to scatter you all to the winds, and I'm going to make him watch. Even as his people began to cry out and weep and fight against the guards again, who quickly ended the skirmishes, Finn seemed to be at a complete loss. As if he was living out his worst nightmare. Eric exhaled through his nose. Maybe a tiny part of himself was glad that Adriana wasn't here to witness this. To see her people branded and sent out across the sea, never to be seen or heard from again. A small silver lining amongst all this darkness. Brandine had tried in vain to take everything from her. He'd failed back then, but now he was doing everything in his power to take everything from Burke. Their leaders, their heir, their safety, their home, and now their freedom. It wouldn't stop here. He would break Finn down until there was nothing left if that is what it took to keep Burke under his thumb. To make Hiccup submit when he returned. And if that happened, then Darin was truly lost. Lofen was keeping him safe for now, but he knew that had its limitations. It couldn't last forever. Darin. His sweet boy, who had saved both his parents in ways he could never understand. Adriana, his best friend, his wife, gone. Finn, his brother and friend, shamed in front of his village after failing to protect them. Genevieve, who struggled against her guards with every ounce of strength she had to get to Finn. whose entire family could be dead at Brandine's will. Hiccup and Astrid, victims of Brandine and Dager's evil schemes for decades. Cliff, his best friend, who was missing. Taryn, clutching her hands to her belly as if her unborn child could tell her where he was. If he was still alive. Alton, who stared blankly forward, as if wondering why he'd been kept alive and tortured and brought back to Burke just to be sent away again. Evan, his friend, whose candle had been snuffed out too quickly. Morgan, who still wept for him. Each person fueled every layer of his rage. He kept his face blank and he remained utterly still. Brandine was still jeering over Finn, his back to Eric. He seemed to have forgotten about Eric entirely. Across the square, Eric was surprised to find Nicholas staring at him. His brother made no outward acknowledgement, the Larson mask securely in place. And yet his brows twitched ever so slightly as Eric's fingers tightened against the rope restricting his hands. He couldn't do much. In fact, he wished he had a blade. But his Jatan steel had been taken from him upon his capture, tossed into a pile of Burkean weapons somewhere in the village. Eric closed his eyes, shutting out his burning village, his people, his friends and family, the jeering. He briefly thought of Adriana and the years they'd had together. They hadn't been married long, but he'd been incredibly blessed regardless to have found his best friend so early in life. To have shared his life with her. To have waded life's dark waters with her. To have found such joy with her. And he thought of Darren. He thought of the day he was born, to the first time he held his son in his arms. He thought of Darren's first set of hiccups and his first laugh. His first steps. His first escape out the door and toddling down the street before he and Adriana had decided that a bell on the door might be wise. He thought of the joy he felt when his son began speaking more than just simple words, but began talking in full sentences. When his intelligence began to show, and his bright blue eyes crinkled with joy. Adriana and Darren were a balm to his soul. They were his everything, the lifeblood in his veins and the beat of his heart, which pounded near painfully beneath his shirt. When he flicked his eyes open at last, he was not afraid. Finn had never felt shame like this before. He thought he knew what it felt like. To feel ashamed for the things he'd done, to carry the burden of his sins wherever he went. Even finding peace within himself didn't always soothe that inner guilt, that he'd hurt people, that he'd caused Eric to be crippled for the rest of his life, that he'd nearly thrown his entire life away. That he'd ever gotten himself into such horrible messes. That he bore the mark of slavery. No one understood what that sort of burden felt like. It had been, perhaps, his most closely guarded secret all these years. And seeing the truth of it reflected in the eyes of his people, whom he'd failed to protect, hearing the jeers and laughter of Brandine's men echoing around him. He'd never felt so small. Or perhaps, he hadn't felt so small since the day he'd been lined up on a platform with men twice his age and hardened by life's cruelty and been sold to an old, evil man. Even back then he'd had a fighting spirit. He'd been afraid, just as he was now. He didn't know what would happen next. The thought of his people being branded one by one and sent away on slave ships, never to be seen again. It was his worst nightmare. All these years he'd wanted to stop the slave trade. Now, not only had it trickled into the archipelago, his own people would be the first to go. Fight it, his heart seemed to say. Don't let them break you. Not like this. He was outnumbered, exhausted, and surrounded. His people were panicking and quickly subdued. His father might never return. Only Gobber stared directly at him from the crowd, his blue eyes intense, his jaw tight. The old man had been around his entire life. He'd always been a steady force, always supportive and guiding him. Just as he'd guided his parents when they were young. Gobber lifted his chin. Though he said nothing, his words were clear as day. Don't give in, lad. Finn swallowed his fear, a tongue of fire rising to replace it. He would not be cowed like this. There was little else he could do, but he would not let Brandine break him down in front of his people. He would not show weakness. If his parents should never return, he was the one they were looking to. The ball stopped with him. He'd do whatever it took to keep it. So fearless Finn squared his shoulders and straightened. No matter what happened next, he would not yield. Not to Brandine. Not to Slaver Anton or Viggo Grimborn. Not to any of them. Brandine seemed to take note of his rising courage. It's futile, you know. There's no point in putting on a brave face. And when Hiccup returns, he won't stand a chance. We'll see. Finn said. You should do yourself a favor and leave now. Brandine and his men laughed. Why would I do that? I'm warning you, Brandine. Finn said in a low, firm voice. This island is mine. Pack up and go now. Brandine rolled his eyes. I didn't realize you were delusional, Finn. Whatever is left of Hiccup's army is no doubt on its way, but it's not enough to take Berk back. Finn said nothing. People have always joked that the stubbornness of Haddocks would get you all killed one day. That day has finally come. As Brandine continued, Finn rolled his eyes and caught sight of Eric, still kneeling in the dirt a few feet away. It was strange to see him covered in soot and dried blood. For all outward appearances, he looked calm with his eyes closed, as if he was blocking everything out. Perhaps he was. A sharp pain of grief threatened to rip open Finn's chest, but he stamped it out. Adriana, his twin, gone. It was too much to consider. But why would Eric lie? And if it was confirmed by the soldiers? But where was Darin? Surely he wasn't with her when it happened. But no, he knew Eric. If something happened to Darin, he was sure Eric would be inconsolable. Unlike now, when he looked so calm. Which was utterly strange. Adriana was his best friend, his closest companion since they were toddlers. In the past he'd been borderline crazed in his need to protect her, to make sure she was safe. And yet now that she was gone. Maybe he was trying to keep himself from falling to pieces. But then Eric's teal eyes flicked open, glaring up at Brandine, whose back was to him and completely unaware. And for the first time in his life, Finn saw the mask drop to reveal nothing but complete and utter rage in his brother's eyes. Without warning, Eric launched upward and yanked the length of rope binding his wrists around Brandine's throat. Finn stared, deaf to the shocked shouts of Berkians and soldiers alike as Eric yanked him backwards with every ounce of strength he had. Brandine recoiled and thrashed, his eyes bugging for a moment before a flash of rage took over. He shuffled backwards with quick steps and slammed Eric up against the nearest wall of a building. Eric growled but didn't let go. Eric was past consolation. He was beyond peace and talking and letting his enemy roam free. He was the embodiment of fury. He would avenge his wife, who'd been put through hell time and time again, and had lost her life in the end anyway. He would protect his son with everything he had left. He might have been successful as Brandine's face began to turn bright red and he struggled, but they were surrounded by soldiers, who quickly converged on the pair. Finn leaped to his feet and was quickly tackled to the ground. Brandine slammed Eric against the wall again, loosening his grip at last. He shoved a hand through the loop of rope and fought against Eric's strength. Back off. He wheezed, glaring at his men, who screeched to a halt. He's mine. Without warning, Brandine slammed the back of his head into Eric's forehead. Dazed, Eric's grip loosened and with his arms held up, he was unable to block Brandine's elbow as it slammed into his stomach. Gasping, he rebounded by kicking the back of Brandine's knee, which buckled. They crashed into a heap and struggled, Eric growling in frustration as Brandine kept his hand firmly in place, blocking his windpipe. His other hand scrambled for a sheathed dagger on his thigh, which he raised to the rope. Eric! Finn bellowed, struggling beneath the guards just as the rope snapped. Eric flew backward with the momentum and hit the ground hard. He only had a second's recovery before Brandine was on him. The dagger fell and he barely managed to throw up his forearm to block it. He threw up his prosthetic and kicked Brandine in the stomach as hard as he could, a flash of pain scorching his own face before they rolled. The guards started forward again. No! Slaver Anton bellowed from somewhere over Finn's shoulder. Finn had never seen Eric fight more ferociously. He'd trained his brother-in-law to be faster and stronger, to know how to fight with weapons and in hand-to-hand combat. Eric had dragged his feet at first, not wanting to learn. Now he got to see his friend's hard work come to fruition as he blocked every strike, made well-placed hits of his own, and somehow blocked out the shouting of the crowd. His single-minded determination was clear: if he could end Brandine today, They could end all of it today. Finn struggled against his captors again and a knee was driven painfully into his back between his shoulder blades. Brandine struck out with the dagger again. Eric blocked the oncoming hit with a quick strike to his forearm and the force of it sent the dagger flying out of Brandine's hand. Momentarily distracted, Brandine didn't see Eric's other fist until it drove into his nose. The Burkians gave a shout as Brandine recoiled. In a second, his face contorted with rage. He didn't seem to notice the blood, but the pain seemed to sharpen his senses. With a bellow he rushed forward in a flurry of attacks, faster than Eric could block. As one of his fists got past Eric's guard and landed him squarely in the jaw, Eric lost his footing and Brandine seized his advantage. Grabbing him by the shirt, he shoved backwards until he bodily slammed Eric into a window, which shattered and sent glass everywhere. Eric gasped and recoiled as he was slammed into the window pane again. Fresh blood slid down his face. He tried to kick and squirm out of Brandine's hold but suddenly Brandine threw him to the ground, his hands tight on his throat. "No! No!" Finn shouted. He wasn't the only one shouting and struggling to break free as Eric struggled, his face quickly going red. Nicholas and Greg were tackled to the ground among others. Lara gave a wail. Thorin and Gobber, Thuggery and Helga and Genevieve. Brandine hovered over Eric's now purpling face. "I will end you here like the weakling you are. You just be thankful Adriana died before you had to listen to her scream." Eric thrashed, stubbornness breaking through, but he was quickly slammed back to the ground. "And when I find Darin, oh. Don't worry, I won't hurt him. I need him for the life we're going to build. But I'll tell him the truth about everything. About how you were nothing but a fake, who never wanted him anyway." Eric's movements turned sluggish. "Brandine, if I may." "Shut up, Viggo." Brandine growled, his gaze focused entirely on Eric. "Where is the boy, Brandine?" His strong words stirred something in Finn's mind. If Adriana is gone, and the boy was not with her, then where did she leave him? Perhaps Eric is the only one who knows. Vastly outnumbered as he is, he couldn't have expected to actually win this fight. Viggo said quickly, his mismatched eyes flicking between them. "But if he's the only one who knows where Darin is, then his location dies with him." Finn saw the flicker of rationality cut through Brandine's rage before he suddenly withdrew his hands. Eric sucked in a breath and began hacking. His face turned bright red and his eyes streamed. Still he shook his head, confirming Viggo's words. "Oh gods!" Finn growled, muscles quivering with exhaustion. "Clever fox." Brandine hissed before slamming a hand over Eric's mouth, pressing his skull into the dirt and looming over him. "I will find him no matter what you do. You won't get out of this so easily." Despite everything, Eric glared up at him with nothing but hatred. Brandine shoved himself out of the dirt and glared down at Eric as he slowly sat up, coughing painfully. He cocked his head and then kicked out. Eric never saw it coming. Brandine's boot connected with his jaw and his body went slack. Eric was unconscious before he hit the ground with a dull thud. Amid the cries from the crowd and many struggling bodies, Genevieve let out a feral screech that Finn had never heard before. "Brandine, I'll take you apart piece by piece. Unless you also want a boot to that pretty face," Miss Sullivan, Viggo said, cutting off Brandine before he could speak. "I suggest you pipe down." Brandine shot Viggo a scathing look. The look in his eyes was nothing short of deadly. The crazed, deranged look of someone who was on the verge of snapping altogether. Eric had surprised him. He didn't take kindly to surprises. Too many might be his undoing. Finn filed the information away for later as Brandine turned his murderous blue eyes on him. "Get him out of here." He could do nothing as he was hauled to his feet and carried through the crowd through the village. Genevieve shrieked behind him and he struggled against the men ushering him onward, unable to see what was happening. The smell of smoke accosted him at every turn as they marched through the village. Streets that he'd walked his entire life were destroyed, covered in carnage, broken buildings and debris. He tried not to focus on the faces of the fallen, but he couldn't help it. The faces of those he couldn't save. The farther they walked and the more faces and broken bodies he saw, the more he realized a pattern. All of the fallen were elderly. Saving the young and strong for the slave trade, he thought weakly, his stomach churning. So many of the fallen had been retired men and women, who'd volunteered to help since they were so short-handed. He'd allowed them to help, thinking there was no harm in it. Maybe he shouldn't have put them on the front lines. Maybe it didn't matter either way. Guilt and shame prickled through his insides with each step. His body ached with every breath. He had been Burke's last line of defense and he'd lost. The fires from the Great Hall still burned and the smoke still billowed upward. The sun had begun its steady rise, preparing them for a clear, beautiful day. He wished it wouldn't. Sunshine didn't match the mood for everything that had happened today. For everything that was coming. The smothering smoke breaths had been the perfect cover for Brandine, cloaking them in fog and darkness, allowing him to creep up on the allied clans unawares. First Sven and Berserker. Then Kara and Braun. Kamikaze and Bog Burglar. And now Burke. His stomach twisted with dread as they approached the jail, built into the cliffs a short distance away from the Great Hall. Finn tried not to think of his sister as the door was opened with a screech of rusty hinges. They strode down the hall until he was yanked to a halt. A ring of keys jangled nearby, the nearest cell door opened, and he was swiftly shoved inside. Finn didn't fight it. There was little point to fighting now, not when his body was exhausted beyond its usefulness. The door slammed behind him and he slowly turned around to glare at Brandine, who peered at him through the bars with a mixed expression of glee and satisfaction. The murderous glint seemed to have faded. More guards followed, one dragging Genevieve in as she kicked and thrashed. She was quickly deposited into the cell beside him. He watched as she was thrown in without preamble. She spun and crashed against the door as it was slammed in her face. He'd never seen her so feral. He was quite satisfied to see many scratches on the bare arms and hands of the men who'd had the misfortune of dragging her in. A final guard strode in with Eric slung over his shoulders, limp as a rag doll. The cell to Finn's right was opened and he was unceremoniously dumped to the floor. His eyelids didn't even flicker with the abuse his body was maintaining. Finn wasn't sure if that was good or bad. More blood had dried on his face, mixing with the grime and soot. That was nothing on the bruising that was beginning to reveal itself on his neck and face. Overall, he looked awful and Finn hoped he'd stay unconscious for a while, so his body could try to recuperate. Well, Brandine said in a prim voice. I trust you'll make yourselves comfortable. I'll be along to fetch you when Daddy arrives to save the day. Finn said nothing. Genevieve, however, had other ideas. What do you plan to do with us? What are you doing with everyone else? We'll break them up into groups and keep them comfortable. Brandine said. As for you, I suggest you rally your strength. Try to rest, he said in a low, sarcastic voice. You're going to need it. With a sudden grin, Brandine strode away. Finn watched him go with a look of hatred. As he disappeared out the door, he found himself staring at Viggo Grimborn, standing near the door with a curious look on his face. Finn raised his chin and glowered. Viggo merely gave him a small smile and left, the door swinging shut behind him with a loud bang. Once they were gone, the jail was mercifully quiet except for the occasional drip of water. Finn gazed around and exhaled. The place was still cold, still dark, still unforgiving. He hadn't been here in a long time, except this time he was in here for a very different reason. Sighing, Genevieve broke the silence and dropped onto her bunk with a creak. She shook her head bitterly. How did this happen? Finn said nothing. There was too much and too little to say. Slowly, he sat on his own bunk and slid a hand through the bars toward her. Genevieve glanced at it briefly before taking it. Her fingers were soft and warm as they slid through his. She slid closer so her shoulder was pressed against his through the bars. At least they were together. Suddenly he thought of Adriana, how Eric would never get to hold her again, how Darren would never see her again, and the emotions he'd suppressed came flooding upward. What would he tell his parents? As if losing Burke wasn't enough, the guilt of his lost people wasn't enough, how could he tell his parents their only daughter was gone? Genevieve made a soft noise and reached through the bars to caress his face. I'm sorry. Finn shook his head. I don't even remember the last thing I said to her. Genevieve pressed a kiss to his shoulder, tears slipping down her own face. Together they cried in the silence of the jail, grieving for Adriana and the other lives lost. There was nothing else to be said or done. Everything felt heavy, like a thick blanket was covering her senses. Her limbs. Her consciousness. Things came to her slowly. Something crackled in the distance. Hearing. Touch. Her fingers twitched, slipping through sand. No, something softer, like powder. Smell. The acrid scent of burning leather and hair. Taste came next with a swift viciousness that she began to choke. The same acrid thing she could smell overwhelmed her mouth, her throat and lungs. Soon she was hacking. And pain overwhelmed her. Adriana cried out as everything came to her in a rush, her brain awakening with a confused flurry. The only thing that didn't come to her quickly, was her sight. Everything was black. She raised a shaking hand to her eyes and whimpered, realizing she couldn't see it. A feeling of panic set in and she hissed, realizing suddenly that she was being crushed beneath something large and heavy. Breathe. Adriana whispered. Her voice was weak and brittle from coughing. Breathe. She said again, firmer this time. Gingerly she reached over her shoulder and felt something hard and unforgiving. It was long and stretched over her back at an odd angle, but she soon realized it was propped up by something cold on her left. A wooden beam propped up on a boulder. And then blessedly, her eyes became accustomed to the darkness with each passing moment. She wasn't blind. It was just dark. Very dark. Tears threatened to overcome her but she shoved it aside. No. Breathe. She had to get out of this place. She had to free herself from this beam and try to find a way out. Memories accosted her as she struggled to her forearms, choking on a mixture of dust, dirt and ash. That was the odd texture she could feel beneath her palms, covering her skin in a fine layer of powdery dust. The Great Hall, the secret tunnel, the explosion. Eric. Adriana's eyes flew open. Oh gods. Darin. She'd promised to find Eric and go back to Darin. She'd broken that promise. The thought of her husband and son sent a burst of determination through her. Gritting her teeth she pushed upward. The beam began to move, sending pebbles and broken wood and another cloud of ash and dust upon her. She struggled to her knees, her body whining in protest as she moved the brunt of the beam to her shoulder. Panting, she hoped she wasn't about to do something supremely stupid, and hefted the beam up before launching forward. The beam came down with a crash, but she pulled herself out of the way just in time. Rocks and wood tumbled forward and she yelped before covering her head and waited out the small rock slide. It didn't last long though and she slowly raised her head, unharmed. Sighing, she crawled forward on her hands and knees before she attempted to stand. A sharp, throbbing pain made itself known the second she tried and she crumpled with a cry. Panting, she realized that now her body was free, her body was aware of an injury that she hadn't felt before. Oh gods! Adriana hissed, then began feeling her torso. Nothing seemed to be wrong until she found a piece of wood, blunt and sharp wedged into the armor of her flight suit beneath her armpit and she gave a yelp of pain. Ow! Ow! Oh gods! Her left arm decided then that moving was not preferred. It was quickly becoming difficult to do much of anything now that her body was taking stock of pains and cuts, bumps and bruises. Gods, how did anyone function through injuries all the time? It was quite cumbersome. And the pain of the wood impaling her flesh was the most painful of all. For a moment she wanted nothing more than to rip it from her body and be done with it, sure that it would fill her with relief. But her brother's voice overruled that notion almost instantly. If you're stabbed, don't pull it out. You'll bleed out before you can get the help you need. Leave it in until someone can help you, preferably a healer. But all the healers were rounded up by Brandine's army by now. Inga was missing in her attempts to find Alton. No, she'd have to do this alone. But not here. Gingerly, Adriana began feeling in her pockets. Her parents had always told her and Finn over the years to never leave home without certain necessities. Before her flight suit wearing days, she'd carry a satchel with all the necessities. Snacks, skin of water, gauze, needle and thread. When you lived with dragons, accidents were almost as common as breathing. She didn't have a satchel with these items now, but she did have a few things. Her daggers were still in their scabbards on her hips. A small pouch was on her waist, in which she'd stored Darren's cloth butterfly, some money, which was utterly useless to her, and... Yes. Adriana hissed, pulling out a long wooden stick. She flicked it against the nearest rock and a spark of flame came into view. She'd put the matches in here just last week after lighting a candle and felt too lazy to put them back in the box. Now she was grateful for them. The brightness of the flame was short-lived as her eyes quickly adjusted. She found herself in a tunnel, mostly caved in from the explosion that overtook the Great Hall. There was lots of wood scattered around, which was rather confusing. The sound of crackling filled her ears again and she slowly looked up. High above her, the entrance into the Great Hall, or what remained of it, was smoldering. It was clearly buried by rubble, but still burned from the wreckage. Flames licked down wooden beams that had once been a long staircase, which had been destroyed. Adriana exhaled slowly, realizing just how lucky she was to be alive. The wound in her side gave a screech of pain as she turned away and she hissed. "Well, most of her," Gobber's voice said in her ear and she giggled. "All right," Adriana whispered and crept forward, careful to watch the match's flame as it slowly crept down the small length of wood. Time to get out of here. She walked what felt like forever but could have been about 20 minutes. It was a long tunnel, clearly man-made, and though she was fairly short for a woman, she still had to stoop at times to keep from knocking her head on the earthy ceiling. She had to stop on a few occasions to light a new match. Counting them up, she only had 4, which encouraged her to quicken her pace as much as she could. If she ran out of matches, she might wind up trapped down here forever. The thought didn't sit well. On her second-to-last match, she found herself at an old staircase, clearly made of hardened clay. But looking upward, she could see no opening. Her heart quickened in her chest. "All right, where are you?" "Finn told me there was a trapdoor." Despite the darkness, Adriana squinted at the ceiling and raised her match as high as she could. The ceiling was covered in dirt and rocks and roots sticking out at odd angles from various plants, except for a square section of wood. Adriana glanced at her match, which was almost out and sighed. Waving it to snuff it out, she stood in darkness for a moment. The light was easier to see now. Climbing up the stairs and gritting her teeth against the pane, she pushed upward. To her immense relief, the trapdoor budged. Gathering her strength, she heaved upward with every ounce of strength she had. She bit back a scream as the wound in her side gave a screech of dismay. The door heaved upward and landed on the ground with a crash. Panting, Adriana paused, hoping against all hope that if anyone was in the vicinity, they hadn't heard it. But after waiting a full minute, she heard nothing aside from the chirp of birds. Biting her lip against the pane, Adriana tiptoed up the stairs. She collapsed onto a bed of pine needles and leaves and lay there panting, her side positively throbbing. When the pain subsided enough to move, she pushed herself to her hands and knees and looked around. The woods were utterly quiet. There was nobody around, no sound of voices or movement. It took a moment to gather her bearings, but she quickly deduced that if the tunnel she'd come from, which had been fairly straightforward, led north, then it was a safe bet that the Great Hall and the village beyond was north. Indeed, the sky in that direction looked grey and smoky compared to the rest of the sky. She glanced up at the sun and marked its location. She sat for a moment, memorizing the area in case she needed somewhere to hide. To her knowledge, very few people knew about this tunnel. The Great Hall might be destroyed, but the tunnel itself was fairly safe. So long as nobody could find it, she could come back to it if needed. So she carefully hauled the trapdoor back down, gritting her teeth against another scream as the wooden spike digging into her flesh seared painfully. As soon as it was down, she took stock of her body. Everything seemed to be in working order, though she had a few cuts and scrapes on her hands and face. One cut on her jaw was particularly painful, but it seemed to have stopped bleeding. Her skin was covered in a dark ashy soot. Her flight suit seemed to be in proper working order. As Lily was a fire-class dragon, it was covered in her scales and her oily secretions that protected the material from fire. The thought of her dragon and not knowing what had become of her sent a pang through her chest, but she pushed it aside. Then she pulled her braid over her shoulder and gasped in dismay as it crumbled in her hands. Adriana stared in shock at the burned hair and then choked on the acrid scent. Suddenly tears welled up in her eyes. Eric had always loved her long hair. She had always loved her long hair, even if she whined about it sometimes. Now, tears splashed down her face and she shoved them away roughly. It was just hair. There were so many things wrong right now, so many things that had gone horribly. The silence was too much and had too many connotations. She needed to investigate to find out what was going on. She needed to stay focused so she wouldn't get caught. She needed to find Eric and Darren and Finn. And she wouldn't be any use to them crying in the woods over her lost hair. Still, she set the crumbled braid down on the ground with a sense of loss. She gave herself 3 seconds to mourn its loss before shaking her head and combing her fingers through what was left of it. The more she combed, the more it crumbled away. She bit her lip to ignore the emotions as it continued to fall away, and gradually stopped. Sighing, she patted what was left. It felt so short compared to what she was used to. Though she had nothing to look at it with and there was no water nearby, she thought it might be an inch or so above her shoulders. Taking a deep breath through her nose, Adriana gazed upward. The sun was rising steadily into the sky, but hadn't quite risen as high as the trees yet. So it was still sometime in the morning. While she didn't very much love the idea of sneaking around in the dark, it would make her a lot less visible. For a long moment she wasn't sure what to do. Eventually she rose to her feet and began walking west. She wasn't exactly sure where to go, but she had to get some idea of what was happening. Had Burke been overthrown? What was happening with all the villagers? Had her daddy returned yet with the rest of the army? No, if they had returned, surely the air would be filled with the sounds of battle, however muted by distance. She wasn't that far inland. Adriana walked for some time, the wound in her side pulsing with each step. She crept around trees and listened for sounds of movement almost constantly. The few times something moved, it was a bird or a squirrel. There were usually more creatures out at this time of day, like wild boar and deer. Perhaps the sounds of battle had scared them off into the farther reaches of the island where it was safe. As she walked, her thoughts returned again and again to Eric and Darren. Were they all right? Were they safe? Had Lofn gotten Darren to safety? Surely she had. But Eric, had he escaped from the blast unscathed? A bark of laughter echoed through the trees and Adriana ducked behind a row of thick bushes. She pressed her back against a thick tree trunk, her heart thundering. A flighty sense of terror pulsed through her chest as the voices grew closer. 2, perhaps 3 men. Calm down. Slowly she breathed in through her nose and back out her mouth. So long as she kept calm and they didn't get too close to her, they wouldn't find her. So long as she kept her head. The faces of those whelps when he said they'd be shipped off to the slave trade. The sheer terror. Imagine falling to pieces so quickly. Well, to be fair, they did just get annihilated. Yeah, but really. The fun is just beginning. The chief ain't back yet. You'd think they'd be filled with hope at being rescued. I'm sure many of them are, but they're old or female. Weakness on both counts, I say. Adriana grit her teeth. They stopped perhaps 20 feet from her location. Look at it all. Green and fertile. This is where I'll build my house, Bert. Right here. So long as you're allowed to pick where you put a house. Why would he care? Brandine's up to his eyeballs in his own plan. Why should he care where we set down some roots? I'm just saying, don't get excited. For all you know, he plans to ship us back to Berserker. And rebuild that Olay rock. There's nothing left but rubble. At least here there's timber. Knowing him, he'll have all this stripped and the timber sent to Berserker. Something tells me he wants to build his empire there, not here. Well, that's stupid. Maybe one day when you're chief, you can decide where to build. Sure. Did you hear that? Adriana froze. She hadn't moved, but there was indeed the sound of crashing in the distance. She prayed it was a deer. But how could it be? Deer didn't make that much noise. The crashing came to a halt, as if the owner suddenly realized they weren't alone. Adriana's heart beat so loudly she wondered if the men could hear it. The sound of metal sliding out of scabbards echoed in the following silence. I'll take the left, you take the right. Gulping, Adriana peeked around the bark of the tree. If they were heading in her direction, She had to know sooner rather than later. Blessedly the two men were moving further away from her location, their weapons drawn. They were a pair of tall, beefy men, broad in every way except in their strangely narrow hips and legs. Adriana briefly wondered how anyone could be so vastly disproportionate and then shook herself. Now was her chance to get out of here. Creeping back to her feet, she tiptoed back the way she'd come. She kept to the soft, mossy patches covering the dirt, and avoided the ones on the rocks. Moss growing on rocks usually made them very slippery, and being so close to the soldiers clearly hunting for escaped Burkians, she couldn't afford to draw their attention. Though she sincerely hoped that whatever had made all that noise was an animal, and not one of her fellow villagers. After a while she began to relax. She could no longer see or hear the men. She leaned up against another tree, fanning her face. In the growing summer heat and the leather flight suit, she was beginning to sweat profusely. Not to mention the stick of wood still in her ribs was growing ever more painful. The snap of a twig caused her to duck back down, her green eyes wide. From her crouched position, she swiveled, but couldn't see anyone in any direction. It was wildly disconcerting. Perhaps those men had doubled back and somehow caught up with her. Then from about 30 feet away, she heard the unmistakable sounds of movement from behind a large boulder. It was thoroughly blocked by a large oak tree and surrounding ferns and other foliage. Anyone could be hiding back there and she'd be none the wiser if they hadn't given away their location. Heart in her throat, Adriana drew her daggers. For Eric, for Darin, for her family, she had an advantage out here. She could do, well, she wasn't quite sure what, but she could do something. She couldn't afford to be captured. So on light feet, she tiptoed to the boulder and raised her weapons. She lifted up a swift prayer for grace and speed and then whipped around the boulder, her daggers poised. She swept out the legs of her assailant first. He landed on his back with a strangled OOF, and she drove a knee into his chest, crossing her blades at his throat. A pair of familiar grey eyes widened and his hands went flying upward. Anna. Anna, T.S. me. Adriana stared, her mind not quite processing what she was seeing. Cliff Smedley was beneath her, his face smudged with dirt, his grey eyes wide in terror, his clothes filthy. And worst of all, his neck was covered in deep purple bruises. Cliff. Adriana squeaked. He nodded, his hair bobbing despite being crushed into leaves and needles. Without warning, his eyes filled with tears. She dropped her daggers as he surged upward, their arms clamping tightly around each other. Her eyes burned and she pushed a hand through his hair. Cliff was out here. She wasn't alone after all. Cliff, what are you doing out here? Asked same Cliff said, his voice broken and hoarse. He swallowed thickly and pulled away, his long fingers catching in her short hair. What happened? Gods, it's a long story. But your voice, your neck. Cliff. He shook his head, his grey eyes shooting away quickly. Nothing. I would better find some place safer than his. There are a couple guards nearby searching Woods. I might have made too much noise. That was you? Adriana demanded, then sighed. Of course it was you. Normally he would have smiled, cracked a joke. Instead he rose on unsteady feet and peered around the rock. Well, of course he wouldn't make a joke right now. They were hiding, fighting for their lives. Now was not the time for fun. Still her gaze landed on the purple bruises as he swallowed and touched his throat gingerly. It must hurt badly. What had happened? Cliff, Adriana stepped forward and then let out a gasp. She dropped to a knee and clutched her side. The sudden flash of pain in her side took her breath away. Anna. Anna, what is it? Cliff's eyes were wide as he dropped to his knees. What, oh gods? Adriana lowered her arm. I guess tackling you to the ground didn't do me any favors. Cliff bit his lip and looked around again. We are way to get that out. How? We have no supplies, nowhere to go. The village. S probably overrun. He cleared his throat again at its raggedness. Anna, there are ways to take care of wounds in the wild. We just need to find the right items. Adriana blinked. Like what? You're not a healer. You forget, Cliff said. My Aunt Mara is the village healer. Whether I wanted tea or not. His voice faded and he cleared it again. He shook his head with frustration. No more than people think. Our biggest worry is finding somewhere safe. Plus, longer that stays in, worse it's going to get. Adriana nodded. He was right. Already she could feel the pulsing, throbbing pain grow in intensity compared to how it had been before. If they were found now, she'd be easy to catch. So where do we go? Adriana asked. It's not as though we have any safe houses out here or hideouts. Cliff held out her daggers and watched as she sheathed them at her hips. The catacombs. No, that's where our people were trying to hide. I'm sure they are overrun by now, or at least being watched. They were corralling everyone into the square. Adriana ran a hand through her hair, momentarily surprised at its short length. Did you see Tarin? Cliff asked. His grey eyes were filled with a new sort of fear she'd never seen in him before. No. I'm sorry. I was running to the Great Hall. Eric and I got separated, and I saw the library burning. Adriana tried to stamp out the emotions rising in her chest. I was such an idiot. Cliff bit his lip. Is Eric okay? Adriana swallowed thickly. I don't know. They were quiet for a few moments. The silence of the forest aside from buzzing bugs and twittering birds was a balm, but it felt wrong. It felt the exact opposite of how they felt. Lost, confused, hurt. Terrified for their loved ones. Cliff took a sudden deep breath through his nose. We'll talk more about everything later, but we really are sitting ducks here. We are way to find somewhere safe, and before you can't move. I'm not strong like others, so I probably can't carry you very far. No offense. Adriana gave him a weak smile. That's quite alright. But you're right, we need to think. Would it be terribly ignorant to go to your parents' house? It's so far removed from village, but maybe TS being watched. She chewed her cheek. You know, that's not a half bad idea. My parents aren't here, at least not yet. Finn is. Finn is probably captured, as is Genevieve. Saying the words felt wrong and yet she wouldn't consider the alternatives. Why would Brandine waste the manpower for an empty house? No doubt everyone thinks I'm dead, so. Wait, what? Why would Hay assume you're dead? Adriana sighed. I escaped through that secret tunnel in the Great Hall. She quickly explained what had happened, watching as Cliff's expression tightened. When she finished, she added, no doubt Brandine's men have told him what happened by now. For all we know, everyone thinks I'm dead. Cliff was quiet. I wish Eric hadn't seen it. I know. Adriana's voice wobbled. After everything without, and I did the same thing. But she didn't look back, did she? And I did. Maybe that's worse. Because instead of running to him. Stop. Cliff said firmly, taking her by the shoulders. Don't you do that. But he probably thinks I'm dead. He thinks he watched me burn just like her. Adriana whispered, fighting to not let the tears fall. How could I do that to him? You had a split second to decide. And once you decided, there was no changing that. Eric knows that. I'm sure he's fine and, probably hurting, but he's stronger now than before. I don't think he's given up. After all, whether you're dead or not, he still has Darin to fight for. That's not nothing. That's everything. Adriana raised her head, the words cutting through the waves of emotion. She still felt like such a fool, but Cliff was right. Eric might be knocked down and she couldn't know yet if he was alright. But he would get back up again, whether she was alive or not. He would fight for Darin, no matter what. And whether they knew it or not, she was coming for them both. Her husband and their son. She couldn't falter now. Not while she still had breath in her lungs and strength in her body. Well, mostly. Nodding, she dropped her forehead to Cliff's shoulder. He patted her back and held her for a long moment. Suddenly she was incredibly grateful that he was here. Come on. Cliff said. Let's see if we can check out your parents' house. If it's safe, then we can take care of your wounds there. And maybe make you some tea. No. Cliff said firmly. If we light a fire, then they'll know someone is there. I'm fine. Even though you're not, Adriana thought but didn't say. Even when he'd had that horrible cold a few years ago and his voice had been raspy for weeks, now it was hoarse and broken. Clearly he'd been attacked by someone who had damaged his vocal cords. But how had he escaped? She set her questions aside as he stood and held out a hand. Opting to ask him later, she took it and rose to her feet with a hiss. If they were going to creep through the woods for a few miles undetected, then they'd really better get going. XXX. Brandine wasn't sure he knew what real happiness felt like. But today, after successfully fooling Hiccup into leaving Berk with the army and laying siege to Berk, he was sure this was the closest he could get to the sentiment. His men had split the people up into groups, mixing the young and old so nobody could rally and whisper amongst themselves too much and threaten any uprisings. He only really had to worry about Finn, who was contained, and the young adults in the guard. Helga and Thorin shot him scathing looks as they were separated. Thuggery of Jut thrashed as he was dragged away from Helga, who watched him go with a raised chin. Too bad Brandine knew the stalwart expression was a front. The true test lay in the arrival of Hiccup and the rest of Berk's citizens. He had a good idea of how to make them submit without much issue, but, well, unpredictability was his worst enemy, and right now Hiccup was out there. Hopefully worried sick and rallying his people to once again ride, but this time to attempt a harrowing rescue of his village. Well, it was too late for that. Or maybe he wouldn't return to Berk at all. Maybe he would rally his forces and perhaps even try to gather more assistance from other villages. As Kamikaze and Ivan were both occupied with their own sieges, and the other villages plundered and leaderless, Hiccup would have very little hope of rallying enough forces to his cause. He'd have his freedom, but he'd be wasting time. Allowing Brandine to do whatever he wished with his people. With Finn. But with Hiccup's track record of obsessing over his loved one's safety, he'd return to Berk. He would never value his own safety over his children's lives. And with Adriana gone, the truth of it wouldn't take much for Hiccup to submit. Brandine hadn't wanted to believe it, but the shake of Eric's voice, the grief-stricken look in his eyes. He knew Eric. It hadn't been a lie. Adriana was gone. Even if he was a bit disappointed he couldn't have the reunion with her that he'd always envisioned, to watch as she fell to pieces at the loss of her homeland and all her people. He could at least relish Hiccup's grief. So long as he didn't do anything rash like Eric. Eric. Brandine resisted the urge to touch his throat as he stepped into the large circular office Hiccup kept beneath the bones of the hatchery. He hated surprises and in a moment of arrogance, he'd turned his back on one of his greatest enemies. His greatest competition. He'd never make the same mistake again. But, as he turned on the spot and surveyed the massive office lined with bookshelves and shelving units covered in vials and jars, notebooks and tools and riding gear, Brandine had to admit that he'd never expected Eric to become so ruthless. But maybe if push came to shove, even Eric could become a monster. Maybe for the boy he hoped to protect, to even die for, even he would sell his soul. The scuff of boots preceded the low whistle. He's quite organized. Brandine turned his eyes toward the entrance where Slaver Anton and Viggo Grimborn sauntered in. Always on his heels, panting like a pair of wild dogs. Yes and no. He's organized, but his creativity makes him a slob. Viggo snorted. How rude. Creativity makes the small tasks mundane, but save for papers and night fury scales littering the ground, I'd say this office is quite well kept. He works more when he's stressed. Brandine said. So of course it's cleaner than usual. Slaver Anton slid a scarred finger along a row of aged books. So do you care to share the next phase of the plan, Brandine? Or do you wish us to merely wander in the coming hours? I would have assumed that was obvious. We wait for Hiccup to return. Brandine said, gazing at the desk littered with gears and nuts and bolts. Once they are subdued, we split the rest of the village up into groups, just as we did with the old and young. And then we wait for your ships to arrive. How odd I find it that they are not here already. Viggo said, his nose in a book on ciphers. Anton turned on the spot. They were caught in a massive storm, putting them behind schedule. My correspondents said they should be here in a week's time. They had to drop anchor or lose the ships entirely, which, as you can imagine, would be catastrophic for us all. Mainly your money pouch. As if you'd think any differently if it were your ships. Anton sneered. And unlike me, you're in a lot of debt, Viggo. If your ships were to be lost to the sea and all the dragons with them, you'd better hope to go down with them for as much trouble as you'd be in. Trouble follows us humans where we shall go. Viggo said, nonplussed. I trust I'd find a way to soothe the ruffled feathers of my debtors. In other words, you'd connive your way out of a noose. Again. Anton said in a snide tone. You could work for me, you know. You'd make thrice the price and pay off. I have no interest in working for you or the slave trade, Anton, as I've stated before. We would drive each other batty. However, Viggo said, raising his head at last with a smile. I appreciate your concern for my well-being. Perhaps I should consider your offer. I might have a retirement with you at the helm of my life. Anton sighed and strode for the door, the only sign of his growing irritation. I leave him with you, Brandine. I have no further interest in bandying words with fickle men. Viggo chuckled as Anton disappeared and shut the book with a snap. He is a man with near infinite patience. Brandine squinted. And yet he raises a valid point, Viggo. You're a fickle man. Does that worry you? I'm flattered. I don't like surprises. Indeed. No doubt why you went ballistic when Eric nearly killed you today. Brandine scoffed and kicked a Night Fury scale out from under his shoe. He did no such thing. He only caught me off guard. Of course. He glared at Viggo as he replaced the book and began surveying the rest of the shelves. Why do you do that? If you disagree, just spit it out. But you don't like surprises, Brandine. I thought it more polite. A flush began creeping up Brandine's collar. Suddenly the sleeveless leather jerkin felt too hot, too thick. Don't patronize me. Viggo turned a look over his shoulder. All amusement vanished from his face. Ah, there it is. Brandine blinked in surprise. He realized his hands were fisted at his sides and they were trembling. He forced a breath out his nose and unclenched them. What? You say you don't like surprises, Brandine, and I agree. Viggo said, folding his hands behind his back and approaching with even steps. You are controlling and so obsessed with the plan you've been shaping in your head since such a young age, that the moment someone does something off script, you lose control entirely. That is why you were so angry when Eric attacked you. That is why you cannot stand me. Because Mr. Larson and I have something in common, we don't like being told how things are going to be. We like to find different moves on the board. That flush began to rise again. Brandine's heartbeat felt rather loud in his ears. Now while you are in charge and what you say does go, which I will not dispute, Viggo said. I would appeal to you to not lose your head. To become so focused on a plan that you cannot allow room for small changes. People, I have found in my life, do not live by a script. They do what they want. Every man, woman and child, regardless of age, has a motivation, and those motivations are fueled by emotions. Or perhaps the emotions are fueled by the motivation. Who can tell, really? An irrelevant question, but the point stands. Lose out on something small and irrelevant for the big picture, or lose the big picture entirely because you lost focus on something irrelevant. This is a decision only you can make. Brandine didn't trust himself to speak. Many thoughts flitted through his head how on the cusp of victory he shouldn't have to be lectured by a failure indebted to people who wanted him dead, a has-been whose ultimate failure had left his victories behind along with his prime. But it was a moot point. To argue would be childish to his own ears and would only prove Viggo's point. This was a small dot on the map of the future he would build. Today was a day of victory. And yet the flush of rage still pulsed beneath his skin. But what made him more angry? The rebuke, the audacity, or the impressed tone Viggo used with Eric, just as he did with Hiccup. Leash the berserker, Brandine. Or we lose everything. Viggo said quietly, and turned away. Brandine watched as he left. He was visited by the sudden urge to seize Viggo around the neck and end his worthless existence right here. Spare himself the trouble and lectures and scheming once and for all. But if he lost Viggo, he'd lose the dragon hunters, and he needed them to keep the Burkians and dragons in check. If the dragons weren't muzzled, the Burkians would have more fighting power, and Hiccup would have the upper hand because the dragons worshipped the ground he stood on, and that could dismantle everything, everything, everything. He wanted to shout. He wanted to tear apart the room for fury. Something burned in the pit of his stomach, something hot and painful. Red stained the edges of his vision. Shoving the heels of his hands into his eyes, he forced a breath into his lungs. He couldn't lose his grip on his temper now. Not when he was on the cusp of another battle. No, the cusp of victory. His plans would come to fruition. The archipelago would be his. Every last Haddock would die, his son would be his, and together they would build a new empire that the world would fear and history would remember. But not if he lost his temper. Spots danced in his vision beneath his hands, but the red faded. The anger coiling in his gut loosened, like an enraged venomous snake being lulled back to sleep. The cool air was soothing to his lungs. The pounding in his veins slowly ebbed away, replaced only by the even beating of his heart. Slowly he lowered his hands. He found himself alone in the dim darkness of Hiccup's office. He'd been here multiple times over the years he lived on Berk. He'd visit Hiccup under the pretenses of getting to know his future father-in-law, though Hiccup didn't know it at the time. He'd given it his greatest effort, too. He remembered attempting to learn all the intricacies of the weapons, flight and riding gear, and other inventions that Hiccup concocted. He thought it was crazy, but filed it all away for later. Every bit of information had its usefulness, no matter how small. Sometimes he'd get so lost inside himself, burying the lost heir to Berserker so deep that he'd forget his mission. Playing the role of boyfriend, future son-in-law, teacher, friend, he'd slipped into their lives without effort. It could have been real. It could have been his. But that rage always pulsed deep within. Buried, sometimes long forgotten, but in a word, it would come surging back. The arrogance of the Burkian people for the way they changed Viking society. Their audacity at assuming that everyone enjoyed their way of life, that the world was better off without Dager the deranged and Alvin the outcast and countless others. Why should Hiccup get away with destroying the lives he did while his men and women, his friends, his family, stood by and watched? Why did he get to walk away from a battle that had taken away Brandine's idol? What was so bad about the Haddock kids living on Berserker Island anyway? Their arrogance and pride and snobbishness was what had led them all down this path. Their own selfishness. Just like Adriana's. He'd known she would fight against co-parenting their son the second he found out she was pregnant. When his plan to make the claim at the convocation had failed, he'd had to think quickly. The only thing he could do was pretend he never wanted the child. That he had no interest in an unfortunate side effect. Well, perhaps that bit was true. An unfortunate sound effect Darin might be, but Brandine had a lot to gain from his existence regardless of their opinions. Signing the document so Eric could take the mantle as the boy's adoptive father was irrelevant. When all of the Haddocks and Larsons were exterminated, he would watch as Darin learned to fight, maim and kill on the bones of his heritage, just as Brandine did. It had been his greatest teacher and a balm to his soul, that the strength in his body and the cunning in his mind were honed and sharpened on the dust of his ancestors. Darin would be the jewel in his crown. The final nail in the Haddock's coffin. But, where was he? Brandine blinked out of his trance and gazed around the office. He would find his son soon. They would be properly introduced and they would start life anew. A part of him would always be grateful to Adriana, despite everything. For providing him an heir, for taking care of the cumbersome parts of raising a child. But from here on out, Darin would be his. And he wasn't without mercy. Just as Dager had done for him, Darin would still have the female touch in his life. He would spend time with his grandmother, Lofn. She could take care of those still cumbersome parts of dealing with children, just as she'd done for him as a boy. That is, if he could find her. She had settled on Berk these last few years, but surely she wouldn't hesitate to come back to Berserker with him. She'd do it to protect Darin, futile as it would be. But Brandine needed someone to take care of the child until he was older. No one else fit the bill better than Lofn. A door slammed open at the top of the stairs, bringing him back to the present. Muffled feet on the stairs preceded a pair of burly soldiers, who nearly toppled over themselves to get to him. "Sir, they are coming." Finally. Brandine smirked. "Find Roscoe and tell him it's time." "No doubt he's already started." They saluted and sprinted back up the stairs, Brandine on their heels. As he left the dark office behind, he felt a rush of satisfaction and anticipation that the chief of Burke would never enter this office again. The jail was silent, save for Genevieve's pacing. Normally Finn might have encouraged her to sit, to save her energy, but he didn't. After their capture and Burke's fall and the news of Adriana's death, he had nothing else to give. She was likely still filled with adrenaline and nervous energy, perhaps even fear of what might happen next. He should say something comforting. But he didn't. Finn knew himself and knew that at times like this, it was best to allow his body to rest, his mind to process, his heart to grieve. He couldn't believe that his twin sister, an annoying girl, who had grown into an incredibly strong woman in more ways than he could have imagined, who had become one of his closest friends, was gone. It was too much to consider. It was too strange. Even if they could somehow make it out of this alive, life would never be normal again. Eric and Darren's lives would never be the same again. His parents would be devastated. Their already small family would now carry an empty space. He wondered who would light his sister's pyre. Would Hiccup have the strength to do it? Or would Finn do it for him? No, he would. To spare his dad that pain, he would do it. And the faces of the fallen joined hers in his mind's eye. His heart gave a lurch and he exhaled slowly. Perhaps now was the time to allow himself to weep, to grieve in whatever way he could, but he couldn't. Not yet. He wondered how long they would be stuck in these cells. How long would it take for his parents to return to Burke? A low groan interrupted the silence from the cell to his right. Finn blinked out of his trance as Genevieve wheeled around, her hands snatching at the bars. "Eric." Finn was already on his knees, reaching through the bars and touching Eric's arm as he slowly came to. "Hey. Can you hear me?" He didn't think Eric could with the way he sluggishly turned over. Slowly he got his arms beneath his chest and tried to rise. His face went red with the effort and he exhaled heavily. "Easy. Breathe, Eric, you can't go anywhere." Eric dropped his forehead to the floor with another groan. "What happened?" "You became well acquainted with Brandine's boot. Amongst other things." Finn bit his lip as Eric tried to rise again. "Please, don't push yourself. I have to get out." Eric hissed, grabbing the bars and pulling himself up. "Darren. Where is he?" "I can't tell you." "Don't give me that crap." Eric leaned against the bars, breathing heavily. Now that he was sitting up, Finn clenched his jaw as Genevieve sucked in a breath. Eric's face and hair was matted with dried blood, dirt and sweat. Combined with the smattering of bruises on his neck and jaw, not to mention the swelling, he truly looked terrible. As if on cue, he gripped the sides of his head and hissed painfully. "Gods, I'm sorry." Lowering his hands, Eric's eyes flashed. "Don't you start. How long have we been here?" Finn allowed the conversation to be steered away. Eric never had been one to focus on his injuries or let others pity him. "Couple hours. And have either of you figured out a way to get these cells open?" Finn scoffed. "There's no opening these cells from the inside. Trust me, I helped build them. There has to be a way. Eric, I know you want to get out of here and find Darren, but I'm telling you it's not possible. Even if it was, don't you think they've got the door heavily guarded?" Eric pursed his lips and glared at the door a few empty cells away. "We can't stay here." Finn shook his head and glanced at Genevieve. "I think Brandine addled your brains. It would be nice if you'd use yours." Eric said calmly. "What do you think they are going to do, ask where Darren is nicely? How do you think they got information out of Alton? The cuts on his face are proof enough of what to expect. We need to get out of here." Genevieve's fingers were white against the bars. "But what can we do? We looked, and they took all of our weapons, everything sharp. They even took Finn's flight suit. There's nothing. Clamoring voices rose outside before the door slammed open. A tall, dark-haired brutish man, Roscoe, Finn remembered, with a scowl, marched in with half a dozen other soldiers on his heels. Finn stood as Roscoe paused in front of his cell and surveyed his stance. A soldier approached with the key ring, which jangled in the silence. "Are we going to do this the easy way or the hard way, boy? Open the door and find out." Roscoe smirked and twitched a finger in Genevieve's direction. Instead of going for Finn's door, the soldiers approached hers. Finn's heart leaped into a gallop, though he fought to keep his expression calm. Genevieve straightened and raised her chin as the door was unlocked and the key withdrawn. In the split second it took the guard to withdraw the key and reach for the door handle, Genevieve threw up her foot and slammed the door outward. It smacked the man in the face and he crumpled backwards in surprise. Genevieve was already out the door as the other soldier reached for her, twirling around him and shoving him face first into the cell. Roscoe surged forward as she yanked a sword out of the first guard's belt and shrieked as Roscoe took a handful of her hair. "No!" Finn surged into his door. Genevieve dropped the sword as Roscoe dragged her forward and slammed her almost face first into the door of Finn's cell. Though her face was crumpled in pain and her hands grappled at Roscoe's wrist, she still stared up at Finn. He admired her fighting spirit, but he couldn't watch her be killed. "Not like this. Stop. Jenny, stop. This won't get us out." Her face crumpled but he touched her elbows, only his fingers able to reach through the door. "Stop." Genevieve swallowed thickly and blinked back tears of pain. "Okay. Okay. Good girl," Roscoe said, smirking at Finn before burying his nose in her hair. Genevieve squirmed as Finn's fingers tightened on her elbows. The scent of smoke and dust on a woman are better than perfume. "Don't you think?" Finn clenched his jaw but said nothing. He wouldn't rise to the bait, even if it killed him to see her handled in such a way. His fingers suddenly met open air as Genevieve was yanked away, squirming and yelping in pain. The other guards opened Eric's cell and quickly subdued him, injured and weak as he was. He too was paraded out, his hands tightly bound behind his back. The final 4 guards smirked at him, daring him to retaliate as his door was opened. Angry as he was, he didn't fight as his hands were bound tightly behind his back and his mouth was tightly gagged with a strip of cloth. He needed to conserve his strength, and besides, he'd gotten the message. Behave or watch Genevieve get hurt. Besides, he wanted to know what was happening with his people. What was going on? Where were they being taken? As he was shoved into the sunlight, he found much of the village had been somewhat cleared. The fires were out, though many buildings still smoked. The only exception was the Great Hall, which still burned and belched smoke high into the air. The bodies of the fallen had been moved out of the streets. He prayed his people had been treated with dignity as they'd been removed from their fallen places. The sun was high in the sky as they approached the town square. The villagers had already been gathered there in groups, gasping and murmuring as he was paraded into their midst. He kept his expression blank and shoulders back, trying to encourage them despite this whole situation. He glanced through the crowds for any of his friends, for Eric, for Genevieve, but he saw none of them. He faced forward and nearly lost his footing. The Burkian harbor was full of the armada that had overtaken them. In the clear daylight, it was amazing to see how many ships Brandine had procured. They were all armed to the teeth with soldiers, as was the village. Archers and catapults were prepared, their weapons ready to be fired at any moment. And the clear blue skies were filled with black dots approaching fast. "Oh gods!" Brandine emerged from the front of the crowd and snatched Finn by the collar amid cries of the villagers. "You're with me." Finn bit down on the strip of cloth, frustrated that he couldn't even speak. Brandine strode forward and approached the cliff's edge, which had a soldier stationed every few feet to the left and right as far as he could see. The protective fence that had been built when he was a child was gone. There were deep holes in the dirt every few feet from where the posts had been pounded. Brandine yanked him to a halt and kicked the back of his knee. Finn went to his knees painfully and gazed down at the 100-foot drop not 6 inches away. "Finn." He looked to his left and blinked at Helga, her blue eyes wide. Inga sat in the dirt to her left, held in place by Viggo Grimborn. And to his surprise, beyond Inga was tiny Ava Thorsten. The soldier at her back kept a firm hand on her shoulder as she stared down at the drop. Further along the line were Helga's siblings, each of them held firmly in place by a soldier. Finn turned to his right and found Eric, Genevieve, and Thorin. Beyond them were more. Kylan, Jackie, Morgan, Vidar and Dustin Jorgensen, Gustav Larsson's children, and others. More children, regardless of age. The children of the men and women who were returning home to save them. As if in slow motion, he watched as every one of the soldiers holding his friends and the children, the future generations of Berk, lifted a blade to their throats. Crying out behind the gag, Finn tried to rise, but Brandine clamped a hand on his shoulder. A dagger rested on his collarbone less than a second later. "Don't even think about it," Brandine growled in his ear. "Don't give me a reason to slit your throat before Daddy's eyes." Finn tried to steady his quailing heartbeat. The dragons had come closer, close enough to pick out their species now. Close enough that he could see the people in their saddles, watching on in horror at the devastation of their village. He could hear the anguished cries of his people high above them. He could see the way Toothless and his dad froze at the head of the large force, his mom holding on to Hiccup's waist tightly. A part of him flooded with relief that she was here. Finn hadn't seen her in days, but the relief was quickly quashed. His dad's spyglass was out. Finn raised his chin despite the blade. "Go," Finn screamed, wishing for all the world that they could hear him. "Anna is gone, you can't win this. Just go." But almost as if Brandine could read his mind, he yanked Finn's head back by the hair and tilted the blade. Finn panted through the gag, refusing to show pain. Hiccup lowered the spyglass high above them. "Come on," Brandine hissed. And Finn's heart burned with wretched stillness as Hiccup raised an arm, signaling the Berkian forces to lower their weapons. The seconds ticked by. Each one felt like an hour. The hours felt like an eternity. It had taken too long to vanquish Brandine's forces at Braun. It had taken longer to rally his people and explain what was happening. To urge everyone to not rush off to Berk without a plan, without thinking of the consequences. To consider what they might see upon their return. It was so much worse than Hiccup had imagined. Kara and Frederick had begged them to stay. To wait, to call for help. Hiccup and Astrid had refused, though she was more adamant than he was. All he could do was stare at the horizon, to Berk. To his family, whom he'd foolishly left behind. Unguarded, unprotected. It had taken every ounce of willpower to not release Toothless and allow him to fly as hard and fast as he could, to leave his people behind. But that wasn't fair to any of them, who had followed him into battle. He would not take that dignity from them. They would handle this together. He would lead them home just as he'd led them to battle. And now that they had returned, gazing down at the torched husk of the Great Hall, from which black smoke still unfurled, at the survivors of Brandine's scourge on his homeland, at the innocent and fearless eyes of his friends' children staring up at him pleadingly, he felt his heart clench painfully. Astrid's arms were like a vice around his chest. "Finn. Finn is there, is he all right? Where is Adri? Hiccup, where is Adriana?" Hiccup shook his head. His breath felt tight in his chest. He took a deep breath through his nose and exhaled out his mouth. "Hiccup." Snotlout said, his voice quavering. "My boys." "Inga." Ruffnut let out a cry as she lowered her own spyglass. "No, not my babies. Please." Fishlegs was mute with terror. Hiccup had never in his life heard Ruffnut make such an anguished sound, nor had Fishlegs ever been so silent. Toughnut bellowed something indecipherable. He'd spotted Ava, his only child, with a knife held to her throat. Around him, he heard them all. His friends, his council, the hundreds of men and women who had just hugged and kissed their children and loved ones goodbye mere hours ago. Who had fought to protect them. To return home and see them on their knees, weapons raised to their throats. He couldn't do it. There was nothing he could do. If he made the slightest error, all of them would die. All of their children. Not only his son, who stared up at him with fearless challenge, urging him to flee while he still could. "Hiccup." Snotlout bellowed, his voice shaking him out of his stupor. Hiccup lifted a hand and every person in his army went silent. Astrid's arms tightened around his chest. The eyes of the young and old, the strong and weak, were on him. Waiting for the fist. For the command to attack, to dive. But it didn't come. Shaking, Hiccup gave them another command. To lower their weapons. To land. Confused, Toothless crooned up at him. Exhaling shakily, Hiccup set a hand on his dragon's brow. It's okay, bud. No matter what happens next, we have to do this. And so he was the first to lead his dragon toward the ground. Toothless swings buffeted the air as they landed behind Brandine, who had watched him land with a savage look in his eye. He dragged Finn away from the edge of the cliff, the dagger still poised at his throat. The Burkian army landed, one by one on any strip of land they could find. They were quickly surrounded by soldiers, their weapons raised. Everyone seemed to be watching Hiccup as he dismounted. Astrid's boots hit the dirt beside him a second later. The air had never been so silent. About time you showed up, Brandine said, breaking the silence at last. His nose was swollen and a strange red line marred his throat. Except we both know even now this fight isn't over. One wrong move and all of them die. He angled the dagger against Finn's throat for emphasis. So, what's it going to be, Chief? Finn's blue eyes blazed despite everything. Urging him to act. To do something. Toothless let out a low snarl. Slowly Hiccup set a hand on his nose. Urging him to be quiet. One wrong movement might set Brandine off. Carefully, Hiccup glanced around his gathered people, those who had been here. Gobber was still alive as were many others. But other faces he didn't see. There could be a great many reasons for that. His friends had landed near their children, each of their faces tight with desperation. Helga and Inga and Thorin all gazed up at their parents without fear. Others wept silently, for fear that these might be their last moments. Tough Nut sat in the dirt before his daughter, all pretense of rage gone. But everywhere he looked, he couldn't find her. Hiccup swallowed and looked at Brandine. Where is she? The words were soft and quiet without venom. Brandine sniffed with derision. Typical. I'm about to split him open right. Please? Hiccup whispered. Where is Addy? Finn's expression flickered. He clenched his jaw and tried to bury some unnamed emotion, but he'd never been good at that. Brandine smirked. And Hiccup saw Eric then, sitting a few feet away with a knife at his throat, too. He was covered in blood and bruises and soot. He'd clearly fought with everything he had, his throat covered in bruises. In all his life, Hiccup had never known Eric to be much of a fighter, save for one time. When defending Adriana's honor. Eric's teal eyes flooded as a hole opened up in Hiccup's chest. No. Astrid bit out. She couldn't. She could, just like anyone. Brandine bit out. I admit it wasn't part of the plan, but she apparently decided to get herself blown up in the Great Hall. Eric witnessed the whole thing. Kinda poetic, don't you think? Just like out, Adriana is dead. Though he could see the symbolic blade coming, it was no less painful when the blow landed. His baby girl, his second child, his friend, the mother of his grandchild. He tried to touch the wrath that he kept buried deep. He tried to find the man who rose up with a vengeance when people dared to harm his children. But he couldn't find him. Just like out, Adriana is dead. Finn's heart was beating in his chest like a dragon's wings on a torrential day. He'd give everything in his body to spare his parents this, to do something to change this. But there was no stopping the crumpling of Astrid's face with a look of mourning he'd never seen from her. There were rare occasions that he'd seen a flicker. But he could do nothing for her as she raised her hands to her face and wept. And his dad, the change was instant. It was like something had been stripped from his skin. Something that gave him hope and confidence and joy fell away, leaving him less than what he'd always been. He bit his lip and looked away, but his green eyes still filled with tears. And all around him he saw his friends on their knees, staring in supplication at the soldiers holding their children. Panic flashed across his face. Finn squirmed, a desperate emotion rising in his chest. Not like this, don't give in, don't yield. Hiccup's tearful eyes snapped to him. Some of that bravery returned. Likely remembering that despite Adriana's loss that could never be filled, he was still a father. He still had a child that he needed to protect. Finn shook his head. He didn't care that he almost cut his throat open, he didn't care that angry tears slipped down his face in front of everyone. It couldn't end like this. They could still fight. For Adriana, to protect Darin, they could win this. But Hiccup merely looked at Astrid, who lowered her hands at last. Her face was red and her blue eyes bright as she sniffed and met Hiccup's eyes. He raised a hand to her cheek and swiped a tear away, just as Adriana always had. And together, they lifted their hands in surrender. As their knees hit the dirt, Brandine lowered the blade from their son's throat with a victorious grin. Finn thrashed and let out a bellow of rage from behind his gag. Eric closed his eyes and lowered his head. The captured Burkians cried out in dismay as one by one, every Burkian lowered their weapons and knelt in the dirt. The dragons roared in confusion at this strange display. Toothless nosed at Hiccup's elbow, urging him to stand. "I'm sorry, Toothless. I can't." Toothless growled at Brandine, who shoved Finn into the arms of a massive soldier. "Get him out of here." With a nod, he bound his arms around Finn's chest and dragged him away, still bucking and shouting behind the gag. "Sir, what about the children?" Hiccup closed his eyes. It might be weakness, but he knew that Brandine wanted him to suffer. If he begged or tried to plead for mercy, Brandine might not grant it just to prove he could. "As much as it would give me savage pleasure to see you both shatter into a million pieces at the deaths of all your friends' children," Brandine said quietly so only he and Astrid could hear. "I've got to think of the bigger picture. No, I've got better plans for both of you." To the soldier, he said, "As I've said before, I'm not without mercy. Release them. Let them go to their parents while they can." Hiccup opened his eyes at the sounds of relief, the scuffling feet from all directions, the weeping. Snotlout and Heather had their arms banded tightly around Inga and both boys. Snotlout's red-rimmed eyes met his through the crowd and he nodded. Hiccup didn't acknowledge him. Fishlegs and Ruffnut were surrounded by their children, Helga watching over them all with a tragic expression. Strong, not broken, but for the first time, truly shaken. Toughnut still sat in the dirt, his arms banded around his tiny daughter, whose eyes peered over his shoulder as she looked around in shock and confusion. Svala tore from the crowd and banded her arms around them both a second later. Ava's wide-eyed curiosity and confusion stirred a memory in Hiccup's mind. Darin had that same expression on his face, just as Adriana had as a toddler. His eyes slid to Eric, who met his eyes at the same moment. He looked tired, heartbroken, and yet he glared up at Brandine as he turned away at the approaching footsteps of a few men. Eric still had something to fight for. Darin. But where was he? "My men have begun bringing in the dragons, Brandine." A deep and crooning voice said, strangely familiar. "Apologies for the coming ruckus, but as we start capturing them, the others may start to realize what is happening and either try to flee or they will stand and fight to protect their riders." Astrid straightened, as if realizing something. Hiccup. "Use whatever means necessary, Viggo. Get the vermin out of the village so we have room to work. Your role here is almost complete and I won't be sorry to see the back of you. Eager for my departure. How unfortunate. And here I thought the fun was just beginning." And as Viggo Grimborn stepped around Brandine as if he was just a useless decoration, Hiccup blinked in shock, stalling the grief, the desperation and fear. Viggo stepped forward until he was before him. Hiccup's shock morphed into a glower. "What are you doing here?" "Come now, Hiccup," Viggo said, crouching so they could see each other eye to eye. "We never bothered ourselves with pointless questions in the old days. You'll need to be sharper than this in the days to come." Viggo's scarred face, one cunning dark eye, one white with blindness, was not one he'd forgotten easily. Nor had Astrid. However, their adventures and battles had faded into the backdrop of memory as they'd grown from teenagers to adults, when they'd married and had children and he'd taken the mantle as chief. It had been a sorrowful affair, his coronation, and by that time he would have forgotten all about Viggo. Except for that part of him buried deep inside that longed for the old days, when he and his friends would wander the archipelago and rescue dragons from dragon hunters. When that was the most important thing. When things were simpler. how far they had come. Viggo had a small frown on his face. Life has changed you, my friend. Hiccup's jaw tightened. What are you going to do with the dragons? Do you really wish to know such gruesome tales? Only be grateful that your Night Fury is so rare, killing him would be a waste. Toothless sniffed in derision. Brandine marched forward with another man in tow. Now is not the time to gossip, Viggo. Without warning, Toothless unfurled his wings and let out a bellow. Surprise flashed across Brandine's face for only a second before it morphed into something challenging. He slid a 12-inch dagger from a sheath at his waist. Come on then. Toothless made to pounce and Hiccup launched to his feet, reaching for his saddle. Not to mount, not to fight, only to stop his best friend from getting himself and perhaps all of them killed. Regardless, it was the wrong move to make. There was a flash of silver and then the dagger caught him in the shoulder. Screams erupted from the Burkians as he was lifted off his feet and hit the ground. The pain hadn't yet registered as Astrid appeared instantly at his side, her blue eyes wild. Hiccup struggled to sit up. Toothless, no. The Night Fury's eyes narrowed to slits at the scent of his friend's blood. He turned murderous green eyes onto Brandine, who cocked his head and drew another weapon. Except this time he was joined by 24 other soldiers. Toothless snarled and approached with his wings poised, ready to strike. Brandine grinned. Astrid kept shouting at him to stay down, but Hiccup struggled, barely registering the pain. It wasn't bad, it was nothing. He couldn't lose Toothless, not after Addy, not like this. Toothless inhaled to fire a blast and the men scattered, save for Brandine, poised and ready to retaliate. But a lone man leaped between them with a hand upheld. No, Toothless. Hiccup and Astrid froze. It was Viggo. With great effort, Toothless swallowed back the blast and stared at Viggo, whose mismatched eyes were firm. Toothless snarled. Look at him. He is fine. Viggo said firmly, lowering his hand at last. Growling low in his throat, Toothless looked over his shoulder and gazed at Hiccup. Those green eyes penetrated his soul just as they had all those years ago. Love mingled with compassion and protectiveness. It's okay, bud. Hiccup whispered. Don't fight. Please. It was all he could manage before his throat closed up. But he knew if Brandine willed it, Toothless would die. Before anyone else could react, Viggo whispered something low and quiet. Hiccup didn't catch it, and neither did Astrid it seemed because she blinked. Nor did Brandine, who squinted. But Toothless did, and as if he hated to obey, he slowly tucked in his wings and sat on his haunches, glowering at them all. What the hell did you just do? Brandine demanded, stalking forward. I merely told him to calm himself before he got himself killed. Viggo said primly. Is that a crime? He's a rarity amongst all dragons, Brandine. Even you can't destroy that. Brandine looked between Viggo and Toothless with a skeptical eye and then sheathed his weapon. He looked properly fed up with all of them. If you're so well acquainted, perhaps you'll do the honor of removing his flight gear. Before the chief gets any other bright ideas. Viggo said nothing. Hiccup, and the rest of Berk, watched in surprise as Viggo undid various clips and belts, hooks and pulleys as if he'd built the saddle himself. The saddle fell to the ground with a dull flop. Toothless snarled as Viggo approached his tail. Toothless, no. Hiccup whispered. He bit back a hiss, the pain of the dagger registering in his shoulder. He wondered if it wasn't that bad, his body protected by his armor, or if perhaps adrenaline was keeping the pain at bay. Viggo made short work of the tail and brought it to Brandine, who snatched it from his hands and sliced off the parts attaching it to the rest of the saddle. Approaching Hiccup and Astrid, who glowered up at him, he began wrenching wires, gears, springs, and leather from it. Hiccup tried not to think of every piece hitting the ground as pieces of his soul as he watched Toothless' tail destroyed. The crowd murmured in dismay. And then Brandine removed the connecting rod. He tossed the destroyed tail to the side and bent down, holding it up for Hiccup and Astrid to see. She glared at him, her arms wrapped protectively around his shoulders, but she could do nothing to protect him from Brandine's piercing blue eyes. I wonder if you recall the symbolism. It was your idea, after all. Brandine whispered, relishing whatever expression was on his face. Your daughter is dead. Your grandson is missing, for now. Burke is mine until I brand every person on this rock with the slave mark and ship them off one by one. Your son is the last of the Haddock heritage and his days are numbered. Your wife's, too. Astrid's arms tightened around his shoulders. And then there's you, don't worry though. I plan to make sure you survive to a ripe old age in which you can spend your days alone, with no one and nothing left. Stop it. Astrid hissed. And all of it will have been your fault. Brandine whispered. And without warning, he snapped the connecting rod in Hiccup's face. Despite himself, he flinched. Brandine laughed low in his throat and stood, tossing the pieces into the dirt. Take the chief and his wife to their cells. A pair of guards yanked both Hiccup and Astrid to their feet amidst cries of despair from the Burkians. A spike of pain flashed through Hiccup's shoulder, the pain finally registering in full throttle. He tried not to react to it as his people were staring up at him in horror. But before you go, Brandine said, grabbing the hilt of the dagger and yanking it out. Hiccup bit back a yell at the pain and then stared down at the blood that seeped down his flight suit. Try not to bleed to death. Brandine, you don't have to do all of this. It's me you want. Hiccup finally cried as he was dragged away. Just kill me, don't hurt my people. It's already a done deal, Hiccup. Brandine said, throwing up his hands in an oh well gesture. The slave trade is a cruel mistress, and I plan to take my time with her. Hiccup stopped fighting, hating himself for it. The pain in his shoulder grew as the blood seeped through his clothes beneath his flight suit. Enraged, Astrid thrashed at his side. His people cried out in dismay as Toothless was muzzled and his wings bound. Toothless turned baleful green eyes on him right as he lost sight of his best friend. Through the tumult, there was only one who stood silently. Watching, pondering, thinking as always. Viggo watched him go with a frown. Life has changed you, my friend. And despite everything that he once stood for, everything that he'd ever fought for, the fear and grief and hopelessness of it all rose up in his chest like a wave. He closed his eyes and turned his face away from Viggo, ashamed and broken. In every way imaginable, he'd failed them all. Chapter 13, Unbroken. After countless hours of battle and turmoil, the silence of the jail was jarring to Hiccup's ears. The mixed screams of battle cries and his people's terror rang in his ears long after he'd been pushed into a cell. Stripped of his flight suit and its various gadgets, he now sat on his cot in mute silence, trying to process. To think past the grief threatening to overwhelm him with every breath. Addy. Astrid paced her cell beside Hiccup's, watching on with worried blue eyes as his shoulder was stitched up by the slave girl, Zoe. Beyond her, Eric was being tended to by Inga, while Finn and Genevieve watched on in silence. Had they been in these cells for hours before Hiccup and the army had returned? How long had the battle been? Judging by the state of the village, clearly Brandine had given the siege everything he had. For his part, so had Finn. Exhaustion lined every muscle in his body, despite the worried look in his eyes. And yet no amount of exhaustion could cover up the guilt lining his features. Hiccup wanted to say something, to give them encouragement, to tell them they'd done everything they could. But he knew it would sound hollow, even to his own ears. After all, it would do nothing to change their circumstances. It wouldn't bring anyone back. Adriana's face swam before his eyes and he closed them tightly. I am sorry, Zoe said in a quiet voice. Her accent was thick and yet her Norse was clear. I am almost finished. Hiccup opened his eyes and shook his head. The pain is not your doing. Her dark eyes flicked to his and softened. She said nothing as she snipped the end of the thread and proceeded to wash the stitches. His shoulder was nearly fully wrapped in clean, white gauze by the time she spoke again. I will bring you a clean shirt, Chief. My master wishes for you to remain healthy. I'm sure he does, Hiccup said bitterly. I'd hate to spoil Brandine's fun. Zoe shook her head as she gathered up his blooded clothes. My master is Viggo Grimborn. His interest sharpened, cutting through the grief. Really? How long have you worked for him? She paused, gauging his expression. 2 years. How did you come to work for him? Again, she seemed to mull over her words. I was in great need of a benefactor. He made me an offer I could not refuse. Despite everything, Hiccup wanted to know more. He'd never thought Viggo Grimborn would stoop so low as to keep slaves. Time and circumstances could change anyone, this much he knew for himself. But some foundational things did not change. Viggo was practical but never needlessly cruel. Ruthless and calculating and determined, yes. But cruel. Before he could ask anything else, Zoe held up something small and tattered from the wad of clothes. It was Mr. Gobcup. Hiccup's heart shuddered. This fell out of your suit when they took it, Zoe said quietly, noting how Astrid had ceased her pacing at the sight of the doll. Would you like to keep it? He remembered a simpler time when a small girl with pigtails and a purple skirt used to carry that doll around everywhere she went, gabbing and singing to it all the while. It was my daughter's, he whispered. Something shifted in Zoe's eyes and she beheld the doll. My barber once made me a doll. Sometimes I wonder. Shaking herself out of some faraway memory, she gently set the doll in his hands. Though I have no right to such thoughts. I am sorry for your loss. Something sharp ached his chest and he thought he might choke on it. Hiccup opened his mouth to reply, but was interrupted by the sound of a sharp gasp. Inga was helping Eric remove his armor, which lay in a heap at his feet. As each layer of armor was removed, more injuries were revealed. Now that his face was washed of blood and grime, the bruising and swelling was more prominent. The cut on his brow seemed to have stopped bleeding, but another cut in his hairline began to trickle blood again. Eric was never one to fuss over injuries, but now his face was tight with pain. Hiccup scanned him head to toe, but couldn't see anything. Perhaps his leg was hurting. Inga seemed to have the same idea. Your leg? No, Eric said in a choked whisper. Neck or shoulder, I don't know. With a gentleness she rarely showed, Inga helped pull his shirt over his head. Hiccup began to wonder if perhaps he'd broken a rib or two based on the bruises and his increased breathing, when Astrid suddenly sucked in a breath. Inga, there's glass in his back. Inga immediately went to his back and cursed. Sure enough, a piece of glass was impaled into the soft space between his neck and shoulder around which blood had seeped. Eric, why didn't you say? Ha, Eric said in a hushed whisper. His teal eyes were unfocused. That explains it. He suddenly tilted and Inga banded her arms around his torso. Finn jumped to his feet. Is he okay? Eric. Hey, stay with me. Inga said, ignoring Finn. Eric's body went slack and Inga slowly eased him to his knees. Breathe, Eric, stay with me. Eric's head lolled for a second but it seemed to fade quickly because suddenly he blinked and looked around out in confusion. What? Ing. It's okay. Inga said in a calm voice. Breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth. Good, again. Hiccup hadn't even realized he'd stood and was gripping the bars tightly. Even Zoe had stilled from her duties, her healer's eyes focused on the pair. Astrid had crouched beside them and reached through the bars to take Eric's hand. The gesture reminded him of Adriana and Hiccup fought another wave of grief. Oh, how his Addie would fuss and weep at this. As if in a haze Eric slowly looked around, his face less pale now. He seemed to slowly realize what had happened and that he was now on the floor, and that his hand was being held. His eyes followed the arms and he stared at Astrid in brief confusion. Hey there, Astrid said gently. Can you hear me? Eric nodded. I didn't know there was glass. Every word seemed to take a great deal of effort. Sorry. Don't apologize, Inga said, her arms still firmly banded around his chest. But I do need to get it out. Zoe, I might need help with this. Of course. Zoe said, exiting and locking Hiccup's cell. I am happy to help in any way I can. Astrid glared over her shoulder. As if your people didn't do this. Zoe paused halfway to Eric's cell and stared down at Astrid, her expression impassive. Trained from years of hardship to hide her true inner thoughts. And yet the gentleness and kindness she had shown Hiccup just moments ago couldn't mean nothing. Leave her alone, Mom. Finn said quietly. His blue eyes were on Zoe as she continued to Eric's cell, carefully avoiding Astrid's stern blue eyes, but she glanced at Finn as she opened the door. You are fearless, Finn. Finn said nothing. I have heard much about you. From Brandine, no doubt. No. Zoe dropped her gaze and knelt in front of Eric with a small smile. Your friend, Alton. He had much to say about his spirited friend. Finn seemed to mull over these words for a moment. I didn't realize Alton had much to say about me. After everything, I think he was the brave one. Though Zoe's hands were gentle as she surveyed Eric's wounds, from the cut on his brow to the bruises on his neck to the glass in his back, her dark eyes were firm as she beheld Finn through the bars. Like calls to like, fearless Finn. And though Hiccup had nothing to say, he marveled at the expression on his son's face. XXX. Eric never had been one to focus on the physical pain. In the days after losing his father and sister, he'd borne the grief like a fifth limb, always there, always present. And in the years that followed, when he began to inflict himself with wounds as a way to deal with the pain in his soul, it somehow taught his mind to ignore the physical pain. To deflect, to think through it, beyond it, ignore it because it was secondary to what was going on inside his heart. Maybe that was why he hadn't known about the glass. Or maybe the adrenaline had finally waned enough that his mind and body finally realized there was an invader. Or maybe his soul was still clinging to the shadows of his old life. Of the love he'd lost today. Adriana's name was like a drum in his heart with every breath. As was Darren. They were the only things that mattered now. Except now that she was gone, they were one and the same. He would keep Darren safe, no matter what happened. To keep his and his son safe, he would surpass every test. He had to. But not if he was passing out from pain. Extracting the glass was a horrible, lengthy process. The girls consulted each other on how best to remove it with limited supplies. In the end, Zoe left and returned with more, as she had permission from Viggo to go where she pleased, and Inga did not. Though she was only gone for about 20 minutes, Eric was having a hard time relaxing. Even though his mind said to be calm, to breathe as Inga had instructed him, his body began to shake of its own volition. Astrid remained holding his hand the entire time, a gesture that reminded him so much of Adriana that he wanted to snatch his hand away from the pain of it. But he didn't. Perhaps stubbornness wasn't always a good thing. And besides, she was a grieving mother, and she likely felt helpless. He wouldn't take that from her. When Zoe finally returned, she and Inga washed their hands and prepared for the extraction. Eric hated that his entire family was hovering over them like he was on his deathbed, but he forced himself to focus on the present. None of these things could be helped, and he was no use to Darren if he was dead or got a deadly infection. Still, for once his mind and body seemed to think the same thing as Inga gave him a thick piece of cloth to bite down on and a new rush of adrenaline filled him. His breath quickened despite his attempts to keep calm. Are you ready? No. Eric nodded and his shoulder opened up in a blaze of fire. XXX. Watching the extraction oddly reminded Finn of the time he'd been stabbed. Admittedly that had been worse by far as it had been life-threatening, but at least he'd been unconscious. Now he knew what his parents had felt like. Watching his brother nearly lose consciousness and then struggle through the pain of the glass being removed from his body was a new form of torture. To his credit, Eric handled it like a champ, as he was prone to do. Astrid's fingers were red with how tightly he was holding her hand, but she didn't even blink. Inga and Zoe worked together in tandem, always communicating. Almost as if they'd worked together before. Finn found himself watching Zoe with an odd sort of curiosity. She seemed quiet, but he assumed that was only a front, her true self masked by her status as a slave in order to protect herself. And yet there was something in the way she carried herself. Confident and strong, despite the odds. Despite the things she'd seen and endured. Strangely, he saw perhaps a version of himself if he had remained a slave. Subdued, challenged, but no less strong. Fearless. At long last the glass was removed from Eric's back. It was larger than Finn had thought, perhaps 2 or 3 inches long with a jagged end. With a huff of relief, Eric dropped his forehead into the buzz with a low clang. Worst part is over. Inga said, squeezing his opposite shoulder. She made to drop the glass into Zoe's bag of soiled items and then saw Finn's look. As seamlessly as if she'd planned it, she hid the glass under Eric's cot and didn't pay it any further attention. A weapon for later perhaps. Finn glanced at Zoe, but she was focused on the same antiseptic liquid she'd used on his dad's injury. If she knew about the glass, she was doing a very good job at hiding it. But why would she care? She worked for Viggo, who was working for Brandine. Unless... Do you like surprises, Eric? Zoe asked suddenly. Or do you prefer to face things head on? Head on. Eric muttered, straightening from his position. Wow. He growled as Zoe poured the antiseptic onto the wound. Finn bit back a grimace. I beg to differ with you, Inga. The antiseptic is always the worst part. Eric turned a glare over his shoulder. Why did you ask if you? To distract you. Zoe said simply. I did not need to know if you liked surprises or not. It wouldn't have done you any favors if I prepared you. I'll be the judge of that, thank you. You are quite sassy. There's more where that came from. Ease up, Larson. You know what these healer types are like. Inga said, though her words were still strangely gentle. And hold still, we have to start sewing you up. Finn could have sworn Eric muttered something about pillows, but he could have misheard. The sudden creak of a bed caught his attention and he turned around to see Genevieve had plopped herself down, her face in her hands. Hey, what's the matter? Finn crouched down so he could look into her face through the bars. Genevieve lowered her hands, but didn't meet his eye. How are we going to get out of here, Finn? He didn't answer. He wasn't sure himself, but he knew that they had to keep a level head and not fall prey to doubts or hysterics. It wouldn't do them any favors. She looked so worried, so breakable in this moment, Finn couldn't help the guilt that rose up in his chest. It made him a hypocrite against everything he wanted to say, but he did doubt. Right now he was doubting everything. His family was broken and unable to grieve. They would never recover from the loss of his twin. His nephew was in the wind, squirreled away into whatever hole Adriana had put him in. Eric wasn't telling anyone his location, no matter how often they asked. Cliff was missing, possibly gone forever just like Adriana. The bodies of his people lying in the streets burned behind his eyes with every blink, with every beat of his heart. And soon Brandine would send every Burkian away on slave ships. Everything he'd ever hoped to destroy in this foul world, to protect his people from, was closing in like ravenous wolves, and he hadn't done nearly enough to prevent this from happening. The grief and guilt and frustration coalesced into something sharp and wild. Without warning he threw his palms into the door of his cell with a loud clang. Eric hissed as Inga jumped, the needle and thread in her hands jerking slightly. Finn. Stop. What the hell was the point? Finn demanded, his voice ringing out in the otherwise silent jail. Every meeting and signature and white flag. Every single thing we did to prevent all of this from happening. Sven and Johan and all those people, they all died for nothing. Adriana. He cut himself short and suddenly his eyes burned. Furious with himself for saying her name, when he was not the only one hurting, he shook his head and sat back on his cot. Genevieve took his hand through the bars. He suddenly loathed himself. He didn't deserve her kindness. Stop that. Inga said suddenly. Do you think if you were gone instead that Anna wouldn't be in that same cell raging that it wasn't fair? That after everything, you deserved better? Of course, she would. So stop bullying yourself for having feelings. Finn said nothing. There was too much to say and not enough clarity to put the emotions into words. And besides, he didn't want to stick his foot in his mouth further, when his parents and sister's husband were sitting feet away, also mourning her loss. As if reading his thoughts, Eric said, she was your sister. You're allowed to mourn her just like the rest of us. Finn's eyes burned and he glanced at Eric, who was staring down at his bare wrists. He was flexing his hands, stretching the tattoos etched upon his skin. Veritas. It was true. He didn't need to feel as though he couldn't grieve for his own sister, just because he didn't want to make the others feel horrible. They already felt horrible. That was the truth of it. Lying to himself and making it about him was almost worse. Why did he always have to make it about himself? What happened today, last night? It was nobody's fault. Hiccup said from his cell, his voice low and even. Nobody's but my own. No. Astrid said in a cold voice that brooked no argument. It is mine. Finn frowned, looking at her as she glared at the empty space between their cells. Astrid Hiccup whispered. Don't. Don't what, Hiccup? Take responsibility. Well, I can't ignore it anymore. Astrid said in a scathing voice, a tone that wasn't really directed at her husband, but at herself. It's my fault we're in this mess. If I hadn't taken off and gotten myself captured, you wouldn't have worried. Hiccup stood from his cot and tried to take her hands through the bars. Astrid backed away, her hands bunched into fists, her eyes wild. If I hadn't walked right into Brandine's open arms, I wouldn't have been the bait that took you away from Burke and Adriana. Her voice broke. Adri, my Adri. His face wet with tears, Hiccup reached through the bars and pulled her to him. No, Astrid, that is not your fault. It is my fault. It's my fault. Astrid wept, her voice muffled against his shirt and the bars. My baby. I got my baby killed. No. It's not your fault. Astrid said nothing else, her emotions beyond words. Finn couldn't take it anymore. He turned away and found Genevieve's face streaked with tears. He squeezed her hand, unable to ignore the sobs and sniffles of his parents' tears any more than he could ignore his own heartbeat. Inga and Zoe finished cleaning Eric's wounds in silence. For his part, Eric was quite still, his expression rather blank. Finn suspected that he had reached some level of exhaustion and grief that was beyond tears. The grief that had raged on the battlefield as he attacked Brandine had waned. It would likely spill over again, though there was no telling when or in what manner. Finn only hoped that when it did, Eric wouldn't shatter completely. XXX. The stifling summer heat rose with each passing hour as Adriana and Cliff waited in the safety of the trees. Adriana felt a keen sense of exhaustion steal over her bones with each minute, as the temperature rose along with the pain in her ribs. The Haddock house seemed deserted. Neither of them had spoken since they had arrived some time ago, watching and waiting. For movement, for sound, for someone to come investigating to see if survivors might be inside. And yet no one came. Adriana thought Brandine might be more than a little foolish to leave such a prominent house, out of all the homes on Burke, unguarded. But given that he believed her to be dead and her family was now entirely captured. Perhaps he thought it was a waste of resources, considering that Burke was now entirely under his control. From their perch in the trees and the height of the plateau the house was built on, they saw when the entirety of Burke's forces had returned. It had been a chilling moment, watching as the large force froze in the air and gradually descended, one by one. The village had then gone eerily quiet. Too quiet. Adriana didn't want to consider the possibilities. Surely her family was still alive. Surely her tribe would revolt if her parents' or brothers' lives were put into jeopardy. Still, she and Cliff had no idea what had happened after their return and subsequent disappearance from the sky. Their vantage didn't allow for much sight of the harbor, and if Brandine was moving ships around, the air seemed to be devoid of dragons, at least from this line of sight. It would be foolish to assume that he didn't have patrols scouring the area above and around the village proper though. It would be very difficult to get information and far too easy to get captured. At long last Cliff sighed through his nose. Nah, I think Eco's is clear. Adriana wiped her brow of sweat and hissed, her ribs aching in protest. The piece of wood felt like fire and his voice sounded as equally rough as she felt. Are you sure? No. But do like to hint after sitting there for more than an hour that if someone was inside waiting or someone like us to find refuge? He paused, swallowing hard. Hey, do be extremely bored just sitting around, waiting for something to happen. At the very least they'd probably RV at some point. Adriana snorted a laugh and then gasped. Cliff gave her a concerned look. Come on. We can wait any longer. But. Nah, if W gets CGHT then M the 1-0 should be worried. Brandine W I'd want you alive. Well in that case, by all means. Adriana said with a small bite. You're of no use to me. Now is not time for snook. Cliff said, standing and helping her to her feet. You're pale as a sheet and sweating like a rose pig. It's only going to get worse. Yeah, it's hot. No, Your body is fighting to keep you alive, he said, swallowing again and looking frustrated with his failing voice. Ether, you realize it or not? Come on. Cliff stepped out of the safety of the shadows and bolted to the Haddock's back door. Adriana paused for a moment, and when no shouts rang out, she followed. She clutched her side and grit her teeth. He was entirely right. Every step was like a blade of fire in her ribs. Nothing happened as they quietly opened the door and slipped inside. They stood together in the darkness of the house for a long minute, listening for sounds of weapons being drawn or breathing. Only a very stealthy individual could remain so quiet upon being surprised, but they weren't taking any chances. Adriana handed Cliff one of her daggers and they tiptoed into the house. It was just as Adriana had last seen it when she'd come to retrieve Mr. Gobcup. The house was clean, save for a single whetstone on the kitchen table. The hearth was cold and dark, offering no warming light as it usually did, with her family gathered around it. The room was devoid of the smells of Finn's cooking and the sounds of snack and laughter, of toddling legs moving from room to room in search of toys and all manners of things interesting and fun. Adriana lowered her dagger, but Cliff pointed up the stairs. He moved up the stairs with a stealth she'd never known him to possess, and she followed. They checked each and every room in the house, every single closet and door. When they came across the attic, Cliff blinked in surprise at the state of it. She gave him a sheepish smile and he noted her guilty expression. Your mother's going, oh love his. Probably. Finally they breathed a sigh of relief. The entire house had been checked and they'd found no one. No signs of entry from any of the doors or windows, no sign of intruders or thieves. It was as if no one had been here since Adriana herself. And then there was a flash of green and orange and a screech in Adriana's ears. She shrieked and threw up her dagger. Cliff grabbed her and yanked her back, sending them both crashing over a huge chest. The house gave a mighty bang as they hit the floor. If anyone had been waiting for them, they'd surely be found now. A small green dragon shrieked angrily at them from the air, growling and flapping his wings. Sharp shot. Adriana gasped, eyes stinging from the pain in her side. Her heart was flapping as wildly as his wings. Don't do that. You didn't recognize us. Sharpshot growled indignantly and landed on Cliff's knee as he sat up, rubbing the back of his head. Are you okay? Adriana nodded and yet cried out upon trying to stand. Sharpshot yelped and took to the air again, his eyes wide in concern. All right, well, Eerie not dead. Clearly nobody's there, for now. Cliff said, standing quickly and hauling her to her feet. Evie gotta take care of that. Now. But, if someone comes later. Adriana panted as he half carried her down the stairs to the second floor. They'll see we were here. A problem for later. Do they keep healing supplies? Gauze and sutures, at sort ofing. Adriana bit back a whine of protest as they entered her old bedroom and she sat on the spare bed. Suddenly she felt rather ill, as if she'd throw up. She took a few deep calming breaths, urging her body to hold on just a moment, so she could think. Gods, if I can endure childbirth I can endure this, too. Ugh, there's a cabinet in the washroom, on the left. My mom has all sorts of supplies down there. Cliff nodded and disappeared without another word. Indeed, she had never seen him so focused on anything. Perhaps he really did have some healing qualities hidden behind the jokes and clumsiness. Or perhaps he knew that there was nobody else to take care of her and without him, she'd. Adriana pushed that thought aside and gazed down at her flight suit. Suddenly she realized just how uncomfortable this entire process was going to be. In multiple ways. Cliff returned a few moments later with a large bag, indeed full of gauze, scissors, sutures, clinking jars of antiseptic pastes, poultices and creams, stiff pieces of wood with wraps and bindings to splint broken bones, extra socks made of a strange rubbery material her dad and Eric used for their stumps to prevent rubbing, and more. Adriana found herself transfixed by everything in the bag as Cliff pulled out what he might need. Yard part will be water, Cliff said. I can't just stick a paste on th injury, I need to clean tea properly and make sure there's no wood stuck in air. Asda from the obvious. How are we going to eat water without a fire? Oh. Sharpshot, Eerie going to need, you okay? Cliff's voice had started to sound very far away. Adriana blinked and looked up at him. The edges of her vision were rather fuzzy. Huh? He looked very concerned suddenly. Put your head between our knees. Adriana suddenly felt very strange. Hot and numb, like her head was filling with a sluggish liquid. Darkness rose behind her eyelids and she felt herself tilt. The last thing she knew was Cliff's arms coming around her and her face falling into his shoulder. XXX. The clang of metal and the squeal of rusty hinges broke the silence of the jail, drawing everyone's attention upward. A beam of bright sunlight broke through the dimness of the jail before it was cut off with the slam of the door. Hiccup kept his face neutral as Brandine strode in with a few men on his heels, including Viggo and slaver Anton. His family got to their feet, except Eric, who remained sitting on his bunk just as Hiccup did. Here to gloat. Astrid snapped. Though her voice was clear, the evidence of her tears was still prominent. Still weeping over your second waste of space? Brandine asked without preamble. That's all children are anyway. Hiccup was pleased to see that none of his family rose to the bait. Brandine didn't really believe that, otherwise he wouldn't want Darin so badly. Other than the pointless diatribe, what do you want, Brandine? Hiccup asked. Brandine surveyed him, his blue eyes scanning him from head to toe. Do you know how long I've waited for this moment? Ah. Hiccup said, leaning back against the wall. So you are here to gloat. I did pick one of the smartest women for a reason, you know. Gods know why she picked you. 30 years and I still ask myself the same question. Why don't you ask her? I also wonder why Toothless didn't just end your pitiful existence all those years ago, Brandine continued. If the stories are true, the scrawniest, stupidest Viking in history. Stupidest? Now that's a bit below the belt, even for you, Brandine. Hiccup interrupted smoothly. I was fighting on battlefields well before you were born, so excuse me if I find your ranting petty and childish. If you think coming in here to insult my intellect is the thing to break me down, you'll find yourself hopelessly disappointed. From his shadow-filled corner, Viggo smirked. Brandine clenched his jaw. How about I start breaking fingers instead? Hiccup raised his hands and gave all 10 fingers a tempting wiggle. Have at it. Breaking things always was your forte. Tempting, but I'd rather start breaking theirs. Brandine jerked his head at the others watching on in silence. Maybe I'll start with Genevieve and those pretty little hands of hers, and we'll see how far Finn can be stretched before he snaps. Hiccup clenched his jaw. Or you could leave them out of it. Take me. No, because that gives you the vindication of winning. Sorry, but I don't call breaking me apart piece by piece a victory. Sure, not physically, but your noble sacrifice would give your family and people something to fight for. Do you think taking them apart won't give me something to fight for? Brandine smirked and leaned against the cell with his palms. No, I think after all these years, the very idea of all the horrible things that could happen, combined with the horrible things that have happened over the years, have driven you into such paranoia that to watch your family be taken apart piece by piece would actually drive you insane. So that's your plan then? Hiccup said, noting the savage pleasure in his voice. To break me down mentally as you break them. That's pretty gruesome talk for someone so young, don't you think? Don't try to appeal to some sort of childlike innocence that doesn't exist, Brandine snapped. If you knew half the things I've done since I was a boy, you'd probably weep if we're being honest. I always hated senseless violence, especially when inflicted on children. Brandine blinked, the only surprise he'd show. Who teaches a child to torture people and act like it's perfectly normal? That it's acceptable behavior. That to get what you want, you have to be willing to do anything to get it. Hiccup shook his head, staring into Brandine's eyes as if he was the child he never got to meet. Are you honestly telling me that after all these years you haven't looked back and wanted something else for your life, something other than senseless violence and revenge and hatred? The jail was silent. His family, Brandine's men, Viggo and Anton all watched this exchange while scarcely daring to breathe. Maybe Hiccup was mad already, to try and appeal to someone who was buried by the evilest individuals of society before he could walk. But nobody was irredeemable. He had to believe that still, after all these years. Brandine was like a stone statue, staring at him in a way that began to feel unnerving. The depth of his stare was penetrating and Hiccup's muscles stiffened, as if expecting him to lash out. You have such a frustratingly uncanny, unwavering faith in the goodness of people. Do you know that? Brandine whispered. He looked rather pale and his voice shook. If you think that anything you say is going to change this, you really are the stupidest person in the room. You're also the biggest hypocrite. How so? The supposed biggest supporter of life, humans and dragons alike, the loudest preacher of peace and working through issues through communication and friendship, became a filthy hypocrite just like everyone else. Brandine said in a rough voice. You killed my father. Hiccup felt a familiar stab of guilt. Do you think it was easy? Killing him? You didn't seem torn up about it when we met. Not when I came to live here. Years after the fact, Hiccup said. Do you know how disgusted I was with myself for Dager's death? I could barely function for almost 2 years after that duel. It tore me apart. It tore my family apart. I almost lost everything. Don't talk to me about hypocrisy when I did everything I could to stop the duel, to prevent it from happening. Don't act like it was to save lives. It was to save my children's lives. Hiccup said, rising to his feet at last. That evil man was going to take my children away from me. Their lives never would have been the same again. If you knew what it was really like to be a father who knew what real love was, you'd understand that. Brandine looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. It doesn't matter anymore what Dager did. Yes, it does. Everything you've done to me and my family has stemmed from the fact that I killed him. If it makes you feel better, I didn't chop him up into pieces like he tried to do to me. A look of rage flickered in Brandine's eyes. No. He died falling through air and smoke, and his body broke on the stones. If he didn't die on impact, he lay there suffering before his body finally gave out, too broken beyond repair. When they brought him in and I saw him lying there, something wild and desperate rose in Brandine's chest then, and he shook his head, a look of suppressed pain flashing across his face for only a moment. A look he probably didn't understand. You don't understand how hard I prayed for you to die in that other healer's house. Brandine, you were a child. Your feelings about that loss were never invalid. As terrible as it all was, how could you want someone else's death so badly? To shape your entire life around it. Brandine leaned closer and the look in his eyes shifted. Because it is the only thing that kept me sane. The only thing that kept me from shattering completely. He was my entire world. I wanted to be him someday. And you took him away from me. Your destruction and my revenge became my obsession. It helped me focus and learn how to bury my true thoughts and emotions. It taught me to plot and spy and lie and cheat. My father's men thought they were just coddling the fatherless child who liked hanging around them for fun. Little did they know they were personally training the best killer the archipelago has ever seen. His voice rose. So I worked my way up, I watched you and your precious little family, waited for just the right time to put my plan into action. How lucky I was when you stumbled on my own doorstep, pushing up my own personal deadline by a year. Oh yes, don't think I wasn't pleased when we ran into each other that day. And gods, how easy she was to please, to slide right into her life after Eric abandoned her like the nose-wiping little snot he always was. I knew at a young age until the day that we finally met that to beat you and make you suffer was to be the best. Better than Dager the deranged ever could have hoped to be. The jail was silent once more in the wake of his words, his hatred. But even now, staring into Brandine's red-rimmed eyes, Hiccup only felt pity. It doesn't have to be this way. Doing all this, avenging your father, it won't bring him back. It won't change anything. All it does is hurt your soul more. Brandine laughed, sounding a bit mad. Your concern for others always disgusted me the most. Save your breath. I've chased this so long, there's nothing else that matters, and I'll openly admit that. Hiccup felt a strange sense of loss. Considering how long he'd wanted Brandine to disappear, it was a strange sensation. And after you destroy me and everything I love, what exactly is your plan? What will you do until you're old and grey? Brandine drew away from the cell bars with a nonchalant shrug. Build an empire. Watch it burn. His blue eyes flicked back to Hiccup's. Do you think I'm crazy? Like him? Hiccup nodded. I think Dager would be proud. That strange look entered Brandine's eyes once again, perhaps some unnamed emotion he couldn't put a word to. He glared at Hiccup for another moment before turning to face the others. Well, Anton. I trust you've had enough time to think. From the shadows nearby, Anton pushed off the wall. Indeed. I admit that I find the sound of a game enticing after all this bandying of words. No, some of us are men of action. He strolled down the aisle and paused before Finn's cell. Right, Finn. Finn stared back. You see, I seem to be missing some property of mine. Anton said, leaning his palms against the cell. Missing packages in the post is quite frustrating, I'm sure you understand. But some packages don't just get lost. Sometimes things are stolen. Deliberately. So file a complaint with the sender. Finn said. Anton chuckled. Cheek won't protect you from me. So I suggest you make this easier on yourself and your family. Where are my missing slaves? Hiccup's heart leaped in his chest as Astrid made a choking sound. Eric's eyes widened. For a moment, Finn looked stunned. And then he looked irritated, but as he opened his mouth to reply, Anton cut him off. Think very carefully. Anton whispered. For I can break bones and rend muscle in places you didn't know existed. You don't want to engage in games with me. Now I will ask again, where, fearless Finn, are my missing slaves? How should I know? Finn asked, his eyes like chips of ice. To those that know my past, it's no secret that I hate slavery. But ask everyone in this rotten jail, my parents always told me to leave well enough alone. I'm one person, I can't possibly stop the slave trade alone. So what makes you think that I kidnapped slaves? Where did I put them exactly? A question I have been trying to answer for weeks. Weeks? Finn scoffed. We just met today. How is that? I've known Brandine for years. I've known of your exploits for longer than you can possibly imagine. Men whisper your name over campfires thousands of miles away as if you're a walking legend. Legendary souls do not earn that sort of respect by playing it safe or following the advice of mere parents who only want what is best for them. Judging by their reactions, they did indeed tell you to leave the slave trade alone. But I know you, Finn. I know you well enough to call you on your bluff. You tell me to ask everyone in this rotten jail. Your parents, your brother-in-law. They know nothing. But someone else does, doesn't she? And Anton turned his blue eyes on Genevieve, who blinked at him. No. Genevieve said, confused. I have nothing to gain from rescuing slaves. Indeed. Anton said, inclining his head to her. Which is no doubt why you will come to regret agreeing to his plan. It will only bring you pain and suffering, little bird. Tell me, will you sing when I start breaking bones? Will you tell me their location? Or shall I break you to make him talk? Decisions, decisions. Stop. Finn growled, his jaw set. We don't know anything about missing slaves. So you aren't the mysterious night rider sneaking into slave camps and snatching slaves away in the dead of night. You haven't raided entire ships and sailed them into the sunrise with ideas of freedom. Anton smirked. You know as well as I do, Finn. Once a slave, always a slave. You cannot remove the shackles no matter how far you run, no matter how hard you try to hide from it. The slave mark will follow you wherever you go. So rescuing anyone from the clutches of slavery is pointless. You're right. There is no running from it. You can't change the past, and I'd need a hell of a lot of people on my side if I wanted to stop the slave trade. Not to mention I have quite the busy schedule, what with working 2 jobs, planning a wedding, traveling to Jet 3, sometimes 4 times a week, watching my nephew and spending time with family and friends when I can. Gods know how I have time to sleep most days, let alone start a revolution. So save the lecture for your Knight Rider, because I don't know what you're talking about. And Finn sat on his cot with an air of finality, his expression annoyed, as if offended that Anton should ask at all. And although Hiccup's heart thundered in his chest, he knew his son. Finn was not the most adept liar. It was one aspect of becoming chief one day that he'd never liked. He didn't like holding his cards to his chest and drawing out his play for the long haul. No, he went for the throat. Hiccup had always respected his son's ability to confidently make a call without questioning himself or his motives, but at times this also made him impetuous. But Genevieve. Even as Anton slowly flicked his gaze to her, she had raised her chin, but her expression was full of worry. Pleading for mercy. Their innocence rang true in her eyes. No, Finn couldn't be the Knight Rider. Ali the insincere herself had sent a letter telling them to back off. Hiccup had addressed it with the council and Finn had sat directly beside him. He hadn't said a word. Well, of course he hadn't said a word. If Finn was the Knight Rider, he wouldn't exactly openly admit it in front of his parents and the entire council. He'd be admitting to risking open warfare in a time when they'd been doing everything possible to ensure the slave trade was kept out of their borders. To avoid their enemies looking at them too closely, to prevent them from sniffing around like a dog looking for a lost bone. Finn had always wanted to do something about the slave trade, yes, but he'd never be so reckless. He'd never put the entirety of Berk in jeopardy. Given his history, Finn was the obvious scapegoat that their enemies would look at. Perhaps the ever-elusive Knight Rider was counting on that. No one on my island has been stealing away slaves. Hiccup said, inserting some authority into his voice. It goes against everything we've been trying to do the last few years, keep people like you out. Anton was smiling at Finn. You sure have Daddy fooled, don't you? But perhaps a little incentive will loosen your tongue. As Anton nodded at Genevieve's cell, Hiccup's heart pounded loud enough in his ears that he was sure the others could hear it. She was yanked to her feet and dragged in front of Finn, who had stood, his hands now fisted at his sides. Tomorrow would have been your wedding day, no? Take a good look. Anton said, wrapping his arms around her from behind in a horrible embrace. Genevieve closed her eyes and tried not to squirm. Beautiful from every angle. Perfect, flawless, supple skin. Stop. Finn bit out. Home. Anton mused, his fingers trailing down to her hand, which he raised. I wonder how she'll scream when every one of these fingers is broken, knuckle by knuckle. Finn clenched his jaw. No. Anton asked. No, I suppose you both would have prepared for this, in some horrid way or another. And I honestly would hate to destroy such beauty. I am not wasteful. He released Genevieve and withdrew slightly, turning her so he could view her body from head to toe. Her jaw clenched in anger, but he didn't seem to be eyeing her with lust. Then a slow smile slid onto Anton's face. Could the answer really be so simple? Genevieve blinked in surprise and no small amount of fear. Brandine, Anton said suddenly. As we have a few days before my ships are to arrive, what with the storm at Zoga and all, I propose entertainment. The men have worked hard and have earned some sort of repayment. Brandine, who stood nearby with his arms crossed as if bored, said, What would you suggest? An auction. Finn blanched. No. Oh yes, Anton said, smiling. Imagine it, an auction for the Jatan princess, robbed of her future on the eve of her wedding night. It will boost morale among the soldiers to squabble for such a fine. No, Finn said, a tone of desperation in his voice now. Then let me make myself crystal clear, Anton said in a voice like thunder. Grabbing Genevieve by the back of her shirt, he slammed her into the door of Finn's cell. She yelped and blinked up at Finn through the door with a look of petrified fear in her eyes. With a sudden tenderness, Anton pushed his hands through her hair and set his nose against her ear. We can avoid this. Tell me where my slaves are and I'll leave her be. Protect them and lose her to a life of misery. Her loyalty will turn to hatred for you and the life you gave her up to, all for a bunch of nobodies. Genevieve sneered and tried to throw him off, but Anton held her firm. Careful, now. I know berserkers. They like their women feisty. Finn's breath shook. I don't know about any slaves, please. Your desperation is only the beginning, boy. As one of the slave trade, I'm sure you perfectly understand the things that will be done to her, the men who will fight for her. What is more valuable to you? The woman you love or the freedom of peasants who have nothing? Hiccup watched as Finn's expression turned stony. I don't care what slaves you're missing. If you hurt her in any way, I will end you. Anton's expression flared with challenge. Oh, how I will enjoy breaking you. Let me out and we'll see who is breaking who. Indeed. Anton said. He momentarily released Genevieve and without warning, he backhanded her across the face. Finn flinched as she hit the floor with a cry. Do you think I don't know which pressure points to hit? Anton asked. He snatched Genevieve off the ground by her hair and she cried out again, grappling at his hand. Did you think your schemes and dreams of grandeur wouldn't come with a price? Finn's blue eyes were glued to Genevieve as she struggled. Her dark eyes were bright with fury. We don't know, she hissed through her teeth. About any slaves. My patience grows thin, fearless Finn. Anton said. Except you are not without fear, are you? No man is. Unless you wish to never see her whole again, yet another useless, broken woman in this world, just like the little sister. So what do you fear then? Finn demanded, his voice hoarse. Missing a payout. A rich man like yourself can't be missing much from a few lost slaves. No, what you fear most is the lack of control. The audacity of someone sneaking onto your turf and stealing away the thing that makes men like you powerful. Except you're not a powerful man. If you lost every slave under your thumb, you'd be nothing but a wisp of a man in rags, and that's no less than you deserve. But the sad part is you couldn't hold a candle to the people who have to put up with you, especially the ones who live in those same rags. Anton's face flashed with sudden rage and he yanked Genevieve up, as if preparing to ram her face first into the cell door. She shrieked and Hiccup found himself nearly breaking his own nose on the bars of his cell. Astrid and Eric had also flinched, though they were as helpless as he was. But the hit didn't come. Anton stood stock still, his teeth set in a snarl and his breath coming out in great heaves. There was a long desperate moment of silence. Then he slowly relaxed his grip on Genevieve's hair and released a slow breath. Then, perhaps even more terrifying, he smiled. You are lucky, he said quietly, that I have such self-control. But as I said, I am not wasteful. After all, a pretty face can sell for a lot. And the berserkers are quite bored after such a trying week. Finn looked like he might be sick. Please. Anton stepped closer. Get on your knees and beg for her life then. Finn's expression turned bleak. It was the look of someone who was being forced to make a decision. And Genevieve seemed to know it too as she began to thrash. No. She struggled to get free of Anton's hold and soon he had an arm wrapped tightly around her neck, cutting off her breath. Jenny, Finn gasped. Don't you dare. Genevieve shouted, a fire in her eyes that Hiccup had never seen. Finn clenched his jaw shut. Panting from exertion, Genevieve said in a tight voice, It's okay. She blinked quickly as if forcing away any tears. It's okay. I'll go. No. Astrid shrieked, slamming her hands against her cell door so hard that it rattled. Genevieve, don't do this. I will not have you begging for my safety. Genevieve said, her voice quivering. She reached through the bars and set a hand on Finn's face. You will stand tall, no matter what happens next. His blue eyes bright, Finn took her hand in both of his and kissed it. Jenny, please. No. Now you raise your head, Genevieve said firmly, tears slipping down her face at last. And don't you yield for anything. And though he trembled, Finn reached through the bars to brush her golden hair out of her eyes. I won't. I promise. Anton gave a long drawling sigh against her hair. So be it. And without warning, Genevieve was yanked away. She didn't fight it, only held on to Finn's hands as long as she could until they met open air. Despite her tear-stained face, her expression was clear. Anton released her with a grin and she stumbled slightly. She raised her head and strode for the door without assistance from Anton or the guards. She would go to her fate with her head held high. She passed Eric, who stared at her with a look of understanding, and Astrid, who was kicking fiercely at her cell door. And then she passed Hiccup and offered him the smallest of smiles. You would have done the same, her eyes seemed to say. Yes, and no. To sacrifice so much for those he loved, the ideals he believed in. He'd give everything of himself and more. But Finn. Hiccup couldn't imagine a world without Astrid, to let her sacrifice herself, to let evil men lead her like a lamb to slaughter. Finn, please, Hiccup whispered hoarsely as the door slammed. Finn, what are you doing? Finn had slid to his knees, unseeing. What did you do? Astrid demanded. Have you been rescuing slaves? When their son didn't reply, she growled with frustration. Finn. He blinked and swallowed hard. I have nothing to say. Well, time will tell. Brandine said. Anton has an infinite amount of patience and he won't be satisfied with Genevieve's noble sacrifice. He will find out where the slaves are, and if he has to pick every piece of flesh from her bones to get it out of you, he will. Finn clenched his fists in his lap to keep them from shaking. You have terrible taste in wedding gifts, Finn. I admit I expected better. Brandine said, moving along the aisle. There was a long, tense silence as he came to a halt in front of Eric's cell. His jaw tight, Eric glared up at him. Bring Larson to my ship. No, Astrid breathed. No. It's okay, Astrid. Eric said, standing as the guards opened the door and he was pulled out of his cell. He looked the image of calm, his mask securely in place again, as if all this time he'd been preparing for this. Don't fight. Bravery and bravado won't save you, and it sure as hell isn't going to prepare you, Brandine said with a sly smile. I am going to get the boy's location out of you one way or another, and we've got all afternoon. Eric's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Have it your way. Brandine stepped aside and watched with a smirk as Eric was dragged away. Hiccup's insides clenched and he gripped the bars of his cell. Please, don't, Eric. Eric gave him a hard look and time seemed to slow for the second that their eyes met. Hiccup thought of every memory in that second, all the chats and adventures and memories. The joys and hardships. His and Adriana's wedding day. Darren's birthday. And then he was gone, shoved outside into the stream of sunlight. The door slammed shut and silence took over the jail once more. First Adriana, then Genevieve, and now Eric. What would Brandine and slaver Anton do to them to get the information they so dearly wanted? Where was Darren? Had Finn really kidnapped slaves? If so, where was he keeping them? The whole idea seemed preposterous. Secrets had never been Finn's strong suit, and yet if he hadn't done it, why would Genevieve allow herself to be sacrificed? Perhaps she truly couldn't bear the thought of her strong, fearless Finn getting on his knees and begging for anything. But what could she hope to gain from putting herself on the line? And then his stomach turned at the realization, nothing. She hoped to become a martyr. She hoped Finn would find a way out of this and save their people. Her loss would be the fuel to his fire and he would burn with vengeance. It would make him stronger. It would also change him. But perhaps she thought, to save their people, it would be far better than laying down his arms and freedom and strength for her, when currently all of their lives were at risk anyway. Love was indeed a strong weapon, and one that their enemies could never hope to understand. But while love could heal all wounds, it could also never be easily replaced. Suddenly Hiccup longed for Adriana. To hold her, for her empathy and clear-headedness and gentleness. To understand the things he couldn't. To calm his mind and remind him that there was hope in the world. There was a place in the world for miracles. Overcome with confusion and grief, Hiccup sat on his bunk with a creak and buried his face in his hands. How had it come to this? How could he have been such a fool to think he'd been prepared, that he'd be able to protect them? His own hubris had got him into this mess. Old memories and fears of failure accosted him at every turn, penetrating his mind. He vaguely registered Astrid's hand on his shoulder. Hiccup, we can't despair. That's exactly what he wants. It was true, and yet the fear of what would happen to Genevieve and Eric was enough to still the words on his tongue. There was no fighting the misery. Not while everyone he loved was being targeted. Brandine wanted him to live until he was old and grey and alone. To relive the memories of his loved ones being taken one by one. What if he never saw Eric or Genevieve again? What if Brandine found Darren? What if Finn had kidnapped slaves? What if Anton killed Finn as soon as he found out where they were? Adriana was already lost, their goodbye and his promises to see her again like ash on his tongue. He couldn't lose Finn, too. And only a few days without Astrid had been enough to drive him mad. Toothless was a rare, Beautiful creature. He would do whatever he could to escape, to save Hiccup, but even that would ultimately get him killed. Brandine had already won. It was only a matter of time before he went mad from grief. XXX. Warmth and the softness of a pillow and blankets were the first things Adriana noticed upon waking. Her mind and body felt sluggish, her muscles whining in protest as she moved. She opened her eyes to see a familiar ceiling with knots in the wood and faded painted flowers scattered across the room. It was a long, long moment before she remembered where she was. What had happened? Burke conquered. Her family captured. Darren hidden with Lofn, safe for now. Eric grieving her